Good evening. Welcome to NavyCon2020. I'm Claude Berube. I'm the director of the U.S. Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis. Thank you to all our presenters and special guests. Our partnership with BU9, represented by its founder and current president, Chris Weave, who's my co-host. Chris, wave. And because this is not an all-day event like NavyCon 2017, each presenter is limited to 12 minutes, so we're going to be going about 3.5 hours, including the special guests. So if you miss any part, go to YouTube, to the Naval Academy Museum's YouTube channel. In the next few days, we'll have it up. Ask questions. Our presenters only have 12 minutes, so there won't be time for Q&A. So what we'll do is they'll either do it in chat or we will do separate videos that we'll put up on the museum's channel as well. This is a team effort, except for one thing. I want to state it up front. If there's any issue the audience has, the buck stops with me. There may be technical difficulties, like I've said before, but if anything goes wrong, put it on me, not the presenters. Just shoot me an email. I'm going to have my email at the end. Among tonight's presenters and special appearances are civilian and military, Air Force, Navy, and Army. We left out Coast Guard because we just watched Netflix's Space Force. We have an Australian and Americans. We have Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Those define us individually. But tonight we're bound by a common enjoyment of science fiction, an interest in science fiction, and what that genre can do in helping us all work together as we have, the folks you see on your screen right now, in preparing for this NavyCon. We're united tonight to study a common problem and how science fiction can help us understand the navies of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So I'm going to kick it off by putting Commander BJ Armstrong here. Folks, if you would mute, and I will shift over.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to NavyCon 2020. I'm Commander BJ Armstrong, the Associate Chair of the History Department here at the Naval Academy, and a contributor at the very first NavyCon in 2017. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually. And like you, I'm looking forward to a fascinating slate of speakers today. You know, the connection between the United States Navy and science fiction is a historic one, and it goes back further than most people usually think about. Early sci-fi offered interesting storylines, fantastic examinations of the implications of technology, and a broadening scope for understanding naval affairs. While he may not have been thinking about science fiction specifically, the great strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote that naval professionals should keep a selection of literature and good fiction on their reading lists because it, quote, tends to give breadth of thought and loftiness of spirit, unquote. Exactly 150 years ago this week, the final installment of one of the great works of the first generation of science fiction was published. Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, A World Tour Underwater, was originally serialized in a French magazine and published over the span of about a year, ending in the June issue of 1870. The story, about a sea monster which turned out to be a revolutionary piece of technology, captained by a madman, began with the United States Navy, as the fictional USS Benjamin Franklin set sail to find and destroy the dangerous creature which had been threatening trade and security in the global commons. Verne's classic novel introduced the world to the potential horrors of undersea warfare and the enormous challenge of finding and eliminating submarines. The frigate Franklin is, after all, attacked by the submarine Nautilus, commanded by Captain Nemo, and she is sunk. The fantastical idea of a submarine prowling the world's oceans with near impunity certainly prefigured the public outcries that would come with the German implementation of unrestricted submarine warfare, and the sinking of civilian liners like the Lusitania half a century later. And the connection to the US Navy did not end with the plot of the novel alone. 78 years ago this week, the US Navy engaged in what many look back upon as its own Trafalgar, the Battle of Midway. In that tide-turning battle, a single US Navy submarine on its very first war patrol spotted the Japanese at 07:55 this morning, the 4th of June. That submarine initiated battle, as Japanese screening aircraft and picket ships engaged her with gunfire, and she maneuvered for torpedo positions. The crew of that ship caused their own share of havoc that day, even if we're not really sure how much damage they did because of the continuing problem of American torpedo failures. The name of that submarine was the USS Nautilus. Jules Verne's classic of science fiction looked toward a future where submarines conducted amazing military operations and threatened the safety of the global trading system. But it also suggested that undersea capability would be a great tool of science, as Captain Nemo and his crew also explored the sea floor and built on the oceanographic work of Matthew Fontaine Maury, another US Navy connection named specifically in the book. Now today, our science fiction doesn't tend to look under the sea, but instead up towards the stars. But like Verne's novel, it continues to balance the multiple responsibilities of navies in both peace and in war. Surely, the future of spaceships and space fleets is a military future, but it's also an economic future with its connected need to protect trade, as well as a scientific future tuned to exploration of the unknown and seeking out new life and new civilizations. These themes, the military, the economic, and the scientific, are distinctly maritime themes, and they're distinctly naval, even when they boldly go where no man has gone before. So please, enjoy this year's NavyCon and the fascinating presentations and presenters you're about to see. I know I will. Their work leveraging today's science fiction to think about naval affairs, using both the mirror of the past and a captain's glass focused on the future, will, as Mgen said, give us a breadth of thought and a loftiness of spirit, whether we're in sea ships or spaceships. Please enjoy the voyage.
In addition to the anniversary of Midway, June 4th is the date in 1974 that construction began on the first space shuttle, appropriately named Enterprise, that led to launches from other shuttles from 1981 to 2011. And now, an astronaut representing the next generation.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Kayla Barron, and I'm the 54th Naval Academy graduate to become a NASA astronaut. My dad is a huge science fiction fan, so I grew up pulling classics like Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy and Frank Herbert's Dune off his bookshelves. Sometimes I was even able to convince him to let me stay up a little past my bedtime to watch Star Trek or X-Files with him. Science fiction has this incredible power, not only to help us understand the world we live in, but to shape the future we'll inhabit. When I think about my journey from the submarine force to NASA, I'm reminded that sometimes we're only limited by our imaginations. After serving for 3 years aboard the USS Maine, I returned to the Naval Academy where I met Captain Kay Heyer. She told me about flying aboard the space shuttle to build the International Space Station, and it suddenly occurred to me that the space station is a lot like a submarine in space. That realization rooted itself deep in my psyche and helped me imagine myself becoming an astronaut and ultimately inspired me to apply. The Navy and science fiction are near and dear to my heart, so I know you'll enjoy this awesome event. Have fun!
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Major General Mick Ryan.
Well, hello there. My name's Mick Ryan, and I'm the commander of the Australian Defence College here in Canberra. Thank you to the organisers of NavyCon2020 for inviting me to speak. I'll be talking today about science fiction and its utility for the national security community and the military profession. Now, there's been recognition over the last couple of decades that this has some utility in how we might think about our national security in the future. And we've seen a profusion of different initiatives in the United States, Europe, and my own country, where we use science fiction to think about the challenges that we'll face in this era of very rapid and complex change. So today I'd like to explore this idea with you about how we might use science fiction to think about the future. But before we think about its use in the contemporary era, I think we need to go back, because we're not the first ones to have thought of this. And indeed, there are two particular eras that I'd like to quickly explore where military science fiction and military futures have been a very fertile endeavour. These are the pre-World War I era and the Cold War. The lead up to the First World War was a time of tremendous change. The late 1800s and the early 20th century saw a period of massive technological change. Science fiction and military futures, or science romances as they were known, sought to explore the implications of this change. We'd also seen the US Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, and the lessons of these wars and the technological change forced military leaders and others to think about what might come next. But it wasn't until the 1870s that we saw the birth of the true military future novel. And it all started at a place called Dorking. Now, the Battle of Dorking, published in England in 1871, foretold of an invasion of the British Isles by an enemy not named, but who spoke German. The novel was written by a serving military officer by the name of George Chesney, who was dissatisfied with the state of British defences and their resourcing by government. I'll note that even though he wrote this novel and it was a smash hit, it didn't hurt him in the future, and he ended up retiring as a full general and a knight. But this was a sensation, and as I said, the first real fiction blockbuster that looked at the future of war. But we really can't go past a better known novel, which is H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Not only is this one of the best known science fiction stories of all time, it was also one of the first that looked at an alien invasion, a war against the other, against a foe that we didn't understand, unlike wars in Europe or in the US Civil War, where the foe had been well known and spoke a language that we could appreciate. But it also anticipated elements of war that would come in the 20th century: biological warfare, conflict on an industrial scale, attacks on enemy railroads and logistics, and the concept of total war, where we would target populations, particularly through bombing of cities that we would see in the Second World War. So there were hundreds of books written about future war before the start of the First World War. Many of them accurately anticipated some of the challenges of the war to come. But despite this, when World War I did come, no one was able to really intellectually be prepared for the scale, duration and slaughter that would ensure. Now, the second important era in science fiction for us to understand is the Cold War era. And this was really the birth of the modern science fiction era. It was a time of great anxiety, particularly in the 50s, 60s and 70s over nuclear war. And we can identify roughly four different kinds of genres in this Cold War era of science fiction. The first one was invasion films. These are very popular in the 50s and 60s, particularly alien invasions, and they were a metaphor for fears about communist takeovers and Reds under the beds. The second genre was war in the far future. And there are many novels in this genre, but in particular we might recognise two as quite groundbreaking: Starship Troopers by Robert A. Heinlein and The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, both of which feature prominently on military and national security reading lists. The third genre was End of the World. This was driven by the threat of nuclear war or resource shortages and featured dozens of books and films, including the great Mad Max series from my home country. And finally, there were books and movies about war in the near future, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And this featured novels such as The Third World War by Sir John Hackett, the influential Day After telemovie in 1983, and Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising in 1986, which foretold of a much more different technological era in warfare, which manifested not long after in the 1991 Gulf War. Now, the Cold War era and the pre-World War I era both provided a foundation for much of the thinking about military operations and national security, but it also provided the basis of contemporary sci-fi. Importantly, it provides us with insights into how we might better use sci-fi to inform our future national security policy, military strategy, and the design of our future military. Now that brings us to the contemporary era. There's no doubt we're in an era of quite significant and accelerating change across the areas of geopolitics, technology, demography, and climate. And indeed, the pace of change can be quite bewildering for many of our people, and it's almost impossible for an individual to keep up with the range of different changes and the interacting changes that are going on in the environment. But that doesn't remove the obligation for national security professionals and the military profession to think about the future and design itself for the future. Now, there's lots of different ways we can do this. There are futures methodologies and other methods by which we plan for desirable futures for our nations. But one way we can use, and an important tool in our armoury, is the use of science fiction to think about the future. Now, science fiction remains very popular. It's in many respects a golden age of science fiction TV, but books and films also remain very popular. We're also seeing national security think tanks and military institutions increasingly turning to science fiction to hone their capacity to think differently about the future that we're going to face together. So I think it behoves us to look at why we might use science fiction and how it can be applied in the development of our strategies to face the future ahead. And I think there are 5 reasons why we might use science fiction in this process. First reason we'd use science fiction is because it helps us to nurture strategic thought and the development of strategic narratives. You can't read science fiction without thinking about the future. It just happens. And in thinking about the future, this is an inherently strategic activity. This allows us then to anticipate challenges and provide us with initial diagnoses upon which we can then build strategies. The second reason is that it helps us nurture diverse views across and within institutions. As I said at the start, we are in an increasingly complex technological time, and this demands diverse views to solutions. Complexity demands diverse options and diverse views, and science fiction can help us achieve this. The third reason is it should provide us with a safe framework for anticipating disaster and where strategic surprise might occur. Roberta Woolsetter, in a classic book that examined Pearl Harbor, noted that in conditions of great uncertainty, people tend to predict that events they want to happen will eventually happen. If we roll forward in the 9/11 era, the 9/11 Commission noted that one of the key findings was that there had been a failure of imagination. Science fiction allows us to use our imagination in a safe way to try and anticipate and prevent future disasters. Fourth reason is that science fiction reinforces the enduring nature of human conflict. Humans are inherently competitive. War, like disease, is part of human existence on this planet. Science fiction helps us to remember that. It's not going away anytime soon. It allows us an enhanced understanding of this reality so that we don't forget the need to invest in our security and ensure we maintain the appropriate deterrence against those who threaten liberty and democracy. And finally, science fiction nurtures hope for the future. I'm an optimist. Science fiction should nurture that optimism in all of us. Everything we do in the military and in the national security sphere is about creating a better peace. Sci-fi portrays a future where humans are still around, and that's a good thing. And we should be optimistic about the future. Why else would we serve our nations but to make them better for our people? I'd like to conclude with a short quote by Basil Liddell Hart, who wrote a book just at the end of the Second World War, looking at the future of war. And at the end of the book, he notes that Our planning machinery has been much improved. Its weakness still lies in too routine approach to the problem on conventional lines. Under a pressure war, much greater use has been made as scientists than ever before. But adequate application of the data requires a mind that is both scientific and military, while for thinking ahead, imagination is also needed. That concludes my presentation on why science fiction has utility for national security and the military profession. Thank you so much once again to the organisers of NavyCon2020 for inviting me to speak. Thinking about the future is inherent in the responsibilities of the profession of arms and the broader national security community. And if the application of science fiction can help broaden and also deepen our expertise in doing that, that's a really good thing. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of NavyCon 2020.
Thank you very much, General Ryan. All right, next, I'll be giving the next talk here, and it's on the Federation's response to the incident at Coppelius in Star Trek Picard, and there's going to be some spoilers, so if you haven't seen it. In science fiction, we are accustomed to storylines. This was partially the case with Star Wars before they turned all to Ewoks and Jar Jar Binks, which I'm sure Major Harper will explain in his talk. In the British series Blake 7, the anti-heroes escape and use the Liberator and later the Scorpio to fight an evil Federation. General Ryan already showed us the Rocinante in the current Expanse series, which will be discussed later in the evening as well. And our friends at the Canadian Embassy, especially Captain Monahan, might be fans of their country's series Dark Matter, which focused on the crew of the Raza. And yes, we all want Firefly back. In Star Trek Picard, the team is aboard the private ship La Sirena in the hope of trying to protect a colony of synthetic humans on the planet Coppelius from being eradicated by Romulans, who view this new race, as it were, as a threat to Romulan existence. A fleet of more than 200 Romulan warbirds arrives at Coppelius. Picard and La Sirena do use electronic warfare to trick the Romulan sensors to, as Picard says, multiply the sensor images and then find some way to disperse them like an ancient warplane scattering bits of mirror. But that tactic is only temporarily successful. Now, this massive fleet should have presented a problem for the Federation. Keep in mind that these events take place in the year 2399. The Federation's problem is its losses in the 3 previous decades. Between the Borg incidents and more significantly during the Dominion War, hundreds, maybe more, of ships are lost. We can assume that Starfleet is not infinite. Despite it supposedly running on a non-monetary economy, ship construction takes time, resources, and trained personnel. Another assumption we can make based on history, sorry, I'm going to go back one slide on that. Apologize, folks. Construction dramatically decreases after wars as the country turns its attention to domestic issues and the lack of an immediate international threat. On top of that, within a decade of the war's conclusion, the Federation's primary shipyard is destroyed on Mars, as recounted in Star Trek Picard, and thanks to Ryan Riddle out there for pointing out a few of the other shipyards. In 2390, the first Inquiry-class starship is launched, and we'll get to that in a minute. 9 years later, the events of Picard with the Romulans bearing down on Coppelius with only Picard and a few tricks are left to hold the fleet. So here's the question. How did the Federation recover from that ship deficit due to the Dominion War and destruction of its primary shipyard to stop the Romulans at Coppelius? In line with this event, how does a great power recover from a shipbuilding deficit to deter another great power if the situation warrants it? Those are not official numbers, by the way. These are from a variety of sources. So here's my take. Lesson number 1, distribute your shipbuilding capability. Build an industrial base. The Utopia Planitia shipyard on Mars was simply too big to fail, or too big to be destroyed in one fell swoop by the synthetics and the Romulans. In World War II, 2,700 Liberty cargo ships were built at 18 different shipyards across the country, thus reducing vulnerability of any one and increasing the ability to produce ships quickly. Lesson number 2, have a common ship architecture. This is the Inquiry-class starship composing the fleet which will go to Coppelius. It's significant that in this battle there's only one class, unlike the other Starfleet battles which we see here, which have multiple classes of ships. So what's the advantage? As my old shipmate and friend Matt Booker suggests, this could simply be a strategic reaction force, pre-staged, set to deal with ad hoc crises. A common ship architecture encourages a stable industrial base, reduces the cost per unit since there are economies of scale even in the Star Trek universe, and reduces the time to build them based on gained expertise. The only significant difference being that I've been able to tell from this are the warp cell configurations, but that's a minor issue. 2 examples in our history might be the World War II era Gleaves and Fletcher class destroyers, though we can assume from Captain Riker of the Inquiry fleet that those ships were more in line with World War II cruisers. They were tough, they were fast, they were powerful in capability, especially since this Inquiry-class cruiser is smaller than the Galaxy or the Sovereign classes. Another example could be the Baltimore-class cruiser during World War II, whose hull design and propulsion would also be used for subsequent Saipan-class command ship and Oregon-class missile cruisers. Perhaps today we could consider the F-100 or the European multi-purpose frigate to have that common ship architecture available among several countries as well. So clearly in the future there's an engineering officer named Mark Van Droff the 17th who resolves all these acquisition reforms. Lesson number 3, deterrence requires sufficient force. Because of that distributed shipyard system and a common ship architecture, the Federation could within a few years build a sufficient fleet to meet the Romulans at Coppelius in this Mahanian battle. Having only 10, 15, or 100 ships would not have turned the tide, and it would have likely resulted in a massive loss to the Federation initially and a wider scale war. Put in terms of the anniversary today, as Commander Armstrong mentioned, how might Midway have turned out with 1 or 2 less US aircraft carriers available? Another point that we should note is when facing the Romulans, they usually back down when confronted, and certainly open to debate on that one. 2 examples are from Star Trek Next Generation when Commander Tomalak has 2 D Deridex class warbirds about to destroy the Enterprise D. But they back down when the Enterprise D is backed up by 3 Klingon birds of prey and they decloak. The same is true when Admiral Sela's force supplying the Klingon Civil War is uncovered. Lesson 4, build alliances. We forget that the Federation may have been Earth-centric, at least in the television series, but it was a system that required alliances and governance among planets. In fact, in Star Trek Enterprise, it begins as a loose-knit alliance toward the end of the series. And there are sometimes when we join the Klingons or the Romulans during the Dominion War. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, like Babylon 5, was certainly brain candy for the international relations realists. Even in the 21st century, we need to build partnerships and alliances. Lesson 5, the human factor. That Mahanian force is there to back up diplomacy in the hope that sanity will prevail, which is what happens at Coppelius. The fleet prepares for battle with the Romulans, giving Picard more time to persuade the synthetics to stand down. They do, and eventually the Romulans are pushed back, thus precluding a wider conflict. So with all the technology, with all the ships, with all the weapons, and with all the artificial intelligence that is so attractive to some, it came down to the best of human traits. It came down to Picard, communication, the ability to rise above past mistakes, understanding one another, trust, hope, belief, forgiveness, the ability to choose what is right, to de-escalate crises. As Picard says at the end, that's why we're here, to save each other. And that's what science fiction teaches us, whether in 2399 or 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to now turn it over to Colonel Hollon. Cory?
All right. Well, thank you to everyone for being here. Thanks to Claude and the U.S. Naval Academy, or excuse me, the U.S. Navy for setting this up. I am obligated to say that the opinions I'm about to present are mine and do not represent the position of the U.S. Air Force, the DoD, or the United States government. Too often, I think military professionals get enamored with tactics and forget or misprioritize their real purpose, employing violence to attain a political goal. Science fiction actually doesn't do anything to counter this tendency, because dramatic scenes of decisive battles followed immediately by peace are great entertainment, but they also skip over the difficult and the messy part in the middle. It reminds me a little bit of South Park and the Underpants Gnomes. The gnomes are replaced with the military and political leaders, but the middle, that question, is what I want to talk about, because I believe that the middle is where strategy lives. Also, we spend a lot of time studying the winners to unlock the secrets of their success, but significantly less time looking at the losers. But I think we can gain equal, if not more valuable insights through an examination of the losing side. This approach can be especially valuable with respect to science fiction because the losing side often has a massive tactical or operational advantage. However, for the sake of the story, they often squander opportunities or lack a strategy to translate their victory into success. Look, if an entire war can be lost because of a cavalry charge, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, your plan probably wasn't very sound in the first place. So let's test this. We're going to take a look at the Kaiju War from Pacific Rim, and yes, sorry to the hardcore fans, Pacific Rim Uprising as well. In 2013, the first Kaiju came to Earth through an interdimensional portal beneath the Pacific Ocean to the south and east of Hong Kong. Trespasser was his name, and he attacked San Francisco and made it 35 miles inland in 6 days, and destroying much of Oakland and Sacramento in the process. 3 tactical nuclear weapons employed by British and American forces finally brought it down. 6 months later, there was another Kaiju, codenamed Hundun, who attacked Manila. Then another attack 4 months later on Cabo. Earth-based forces resorted to nuclear weapons in each case. Well, after 4 or 5 extinction-level threats, the world isn't just going to stand for it, so the Pan-Pacific Defense League was formed, and the Jaeger program was born. The war between the Jaegers and the Kaiju ranged on for another 10 years. Kaiju attacks became more frequent, and each Kaiju was a larger and more dangerous threat. As the U.S. representative to the UN, L. Taylor, said in 2024, Kaiju are learning our defenses. They're adapting, evolving. Those sneaky bastards. The enemy's going to do that. Because of the costs and the losses suffered by the Jaeger program, the UN shifted funding to an even more expensive and massive technical solution, the Wall of Life. The Kaiju, ignoring the Napoleonic dictate of not interrupting your enemy while he's making a mistake, attacked and overcame the wall around Sydney, taking about an hour to do it. The breach itself only supported 1 Kaiju at a time because of its unstable nature. As seen here in the middle there, it's sort of like a throat. It was essentially a narrow passageway between the 2 universes. As it reset after each transfer onto the Earth, it became more stable and was able to reset more quickly. The breach was impervious to assault from humans because it would read the DNA of the Kaiju and only allow them to traverse the breach. It was essentially a one-way door. Additionally, the Kaiju have a hive mind, and all information available to one became available to all. Humans were eventually able to exploit this vulnerability by creating a neural link with the Kaiju. This was called drifting, not to be confused with the Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift maneuver. Hat tip to the comedy team, Pacific Defense League scientists, Drs. Newt Geiser and Herman Gottlieb, who discovered the secret of passing into the antiverse. The antiverse was the dimension on the other side of the breach, and inexplicably where the Eye of Sauron went after its destruction in Middle-earth. Turns out the Kaiju were just weapons sent by a race of beings known as the Precursors. The goal was in the elimination of animal life on Earth in order to prepare it for the precursors to move in. After this drift, Dr. Geiser relays the phased plan of the precursors. He says, quote, "The first wave, that was just the hounds. Categories 1 through 4, it was nothing. Their purpose was to aim for the populated areas and take out the vermin. The second wave, that is the exterminators, and they will finish the job. And then the new tenants will take possession." So the middle is fairly obvious here. Wipe out the humans, no resistance, they're able to take over. Now, eventually, 2 extremely large kaiju, classified as Category 4, came through the breach at the same time. Only days later, a triple event with 2 Category 4s and a Category 5 occurred. But nuclear weapons can solve problems, and Jaeger's Gypsy Danger and Striker Eureka managed to close the breach and, quote, "cancel the apocalypse," end quote. Or at least delay it until movie executives decided the market could support a sequel. Then the precursors use a neural link between the kaiju and Dr. Geiser to infiltrate the Earth, create multiple breaches, and send 3 kaijus, 2 Cat 4s and a Cat 5 again. The objectives of this plan was to converge on Tokyo, fall into the Mount Fuji volcano, ignite the Pacific Rim of Fire, and create an extinction level catastrophe. Oh, and they merge, Voltron style, to create a mega kaiju with drones, because sequels. Okay, so in great power competition, I think it's important to protect and utilize the advantages that you have while mitigating against your vulnerabilities, and that's what this movie is going to demonstrate for us. So what advantages did the precursors have? Well, first, surprise. The Earth didn't know there were alternate dimensions, much less that they could come through the ocean. They were looking for aliens from the wrong direction. Second, the precursors could develop and deploy kaiju without a fear of attack. If this reminds you of the US during World War II, you're right, but you need to eliminate the Battle of the North Atlantic to have an accurate analogy. They had unfettered access without vulnerability. Third, the kaiju hive mind meant instantaneous sharing of enemy battle tactics and capabilities. Fourth, there was a baseline structure for the kaiju that could be upgraded with developing capabilities like an acid attack and electromagnetic pulse blasts, and the timeline for this was incredibly fast. Fifth, in the Second War, they created several breaches that, while vulnerable, nevertheless enabled multiple avenues of attack. Sixth, convergence and interoperability. Combine a carrier, 12 tanks, and a B-52 all at the same time. Now, while this technologically might be beyond our reach, the idea of converging capabilities as a single point to create a virtual mass is very appealing, and the precursors could do it. And perhaps the biggest advantage that the precursors had was that they were fighting humans, which we have notoriously short attention spans. We were also arrogant enough to believe that something we built, i.e. the wall, could stop creatures who had already come from a different dimension. So with all of these advantages, why did they lose? Well, when analyzing where things went wrong, the real beginning of the disaster is almost always around the first moment that you as a leader say, well, shit, right around there. So where did the precursors first say that? A number of errors present themselves that very likely mirror current real world problems that we are having in developing strategy and thinking about our force deployment. The first is a reliance on single tech solutions and/or decisive battle. Bigger and more exquisite technological solutions are very seductive. They offer a panacea to the problems of enforcing your will on another. However, Clausewitz is still right. Defense is the stronger form of warfare, and the loser decides when the war is over, because they're the ones who have to decide to stop fighting and accept this new reality. A single technology and/or a single battle is very unlikely to achieve that goal, especially when the goal is the complete eradication of the enemy. Also, failure to protect the lines of communication, specifically the sea lines of communication. They assumed, the precursors, that the breach was a one-way door into the AOR. There were no defenses in the homeland, no alternate industrial sites, no backup plan in case that single assumption proved faulty. But then, in what can only be classified as a Millennium Falcon-sized hole in their plan, the precursors waited until near the end to deploy any kind of protective force around that line of communication. Third, Curtis LeMay wasn't allowed to fly combat after he learned about the Manhattan Project. maybe, just maybe, this network warfare that we're all so keen on getting into actually presents multiple points of entry for an adversary, as the precursors learned. And finally, the creation of the Mega Kaiju was a last-ditch effort to create a system-level catastrophe. Alighting the Pacific Ring of Fire was a method of achieving human extinction. However, it was what they call a single roll of the iron dice, a reliance on decisive battle. I'd argue that their tactics and strategy actually began to diverge right around their second attack. Trespasser was sent to test the capabilities of the Earth to resist and create some havoc. Cool, fine. But Hundun's, the second Kaiju's, attack on Manila doesn't make any sense. In fact, the entirety of the plan doesn't make a lot of sense. If the goal is to eliminate the vermin, and you discover in the first attack that the vermin can fight back, you gotta reevaluate. Instead, Hundun went ahead and attacked Manila. And then after that, KSF goes after Cabo. Now it's gone completely off the rails. Because force deployment should always align with the strategic goal. As B.H. Liddell Hart said, quote, "The longest way round is often the shortest way home," end quote. In other words, if the goal is the ultimate destruction of the enemy, not every move should be to throw your strength against theirs. Instead, those with the massive advantages should look to capitalize on and protect those advantages. The single most important advantage the precursors had was the one-way door, the breach itself. They should have guarded that, capitalized on their surprise, massed their forces, and aligned their actions with the desired outcome. Now, on the surface, the precursors and the Kaiju don't have a lot to teach us. They got unlucky because of human heroes. But if we see strategy as a theory about what actions will create an advantageous cessation of hostilities, then there are a number of lessons to learn. The precursors were essentially the underpants gnomes. But it was send the Kaiju to make a mess, something, 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 and all humans wind up dead. The question and the challenge is to look at current military force deployment and overall strategy and ask, what's that part in the middle? Because, my friends, right now, we in the United States have most of the advantages. And if we don't figure out how to translate those advantages into a desired political relationship with the rest of the world, we could eventually suffer the fate of the precursors, cut off from our goals and unable to act in the world we want to. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Claude.
Thanks, Cory. And it's really my pleasure to show this pre-recorded message from Dr. Kori Schake with the American Enterprise Institute.
The hardest thing for policymakers to do is to relax known constraints on a problem. And that's what science fiction does for us. Because if the United States had always been the dominant technological power militarily in people's professional lifetimes, there's a tendency to carry that bias forward in your thinking. Or if Chinese GDP growth has been 8-9% for 10 years, there's a tendency to straight line that outwards. What science fiction does for us as policymakers is help us relax known constraints on the problem, to use our imaginations more fulsomely, more fulgently, to think about what could be different and how can we come up with creative ways to manage those differences. That's what science fiction does for us, that policymakers urgently need when handling problems of the magnitude and discontinuousness of great power competition.
And August Cole, over to you. We got August on?
Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be able to talk to my fellow travelers in the science fiction community. It is a great pleasure to be talking to an actual con. This is my first one, if you can believe it. So I have a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about being able to talk to you for this 12-minute block here. I'm going to kind of talk to you about the way that I've been thinking about how we use fiction in the development of ideas that are relevant for professional military education, for actual development of strategy and technology. One of the hardest things actually is to give it a name. What is it that we are trying to do? And I've been thinking about it in the context of something called fiction, which is, of course, derived from this aspect of the intelligence community's labeling of things that they hear, see, et cetera, like electronic intelligence, human intelligence. And by giving, you know, a somewhat silly name to the science fiction, though, that we all like to consume and sometimes write, it allows us, though, to make it seem, in effect, even more official, to create that sort of acceptance, which is thankfully growing and growing with each day. One of the reasons I think why it is so important right now that we do have access to stories, films, even video games, is because the speed of change in the world is such that the conventional approaches to trying to make sense of everything are really incredibly out of date or out of step, even if they are more contemporary in those approaches. You know, this era of data, for example, is almost incomprehensible given, especially for a history major like me. You know, the idea that Clive Humby, mathematician in 2006, said that data is the new oil has an altogether different context when you think about the universe of digital information that is being produced. At the World Economic Forum, it expected in 2020, we'd have like 44 zettabytes of data. And if we actually are at that level right now, that's like 40 times more bytes than there are stars in the universe as we see it. And to me, it fits into this construct of data is the new ammunition. That warfare is changing, whether it's at sea, whether it's in cyberspace, whether it's on land, whether it's in the kind of cognitive domain, that nothing will happen without that sort of appreciation for the vastness of the challenge and how we really have to struggle to get our heads around it. Fortunately, fiction is exceptionally, I think, adept at that because it allows us to focus on the ever important human element. Often we are confronted with conceptions of whether it's warfare, whether it's society look like, that don't fully honor or really reflect, I think, the actualities of what it's like to live in those worlds. And so from my perspective, being able to create synthetic environments that reflect the senses that we all have, but also the sorts of research and analytical approaches that people who write white papers or conventional reports take. This concept of useful fiction, you know, something that we've explored with Ghost Fleet, now Burn-In, and other work that I've done, I think is really underscored in its value because of the sort of transparency that you actually end up taking with the reader when you do something like, let's say, add footnotes, offering up the sort of research that you discover on your journey to try to make sense of what's ahead. And that humility, I think, is really important because we are all experiencing our own futures in a way. And that's, of course, increasingly going to accelerate as augmented reality comes online, perhaps in the next 2 to 3 years. You know, Apple in the last month has kind of drawn the curtain back on some of its latest products that it's seeking to explore. You know, William Gibson, the science fiction writer, one of the people who's probably most influential for me, had said almost 20 years ago that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think about that quote often because it is a really, I think, apt encapsulation of the challenge that we have in being able to see not only our present, but what's ahead from different perspectives that are really unlike anything that we might naturally gravitate towards. And in fact, those are the voices and points of view that can be the most useful because that's where surprise ultimately comes from, for better or for worse. And as I've spent like the last 8 years, more or less, thinking about the future of conflict with Ghost Fleet, you know, trying to imagine how a over-reliance on technology could hinder the U.S. in its kind of strategic contest with China, how underappreciating, for example, the Chinese government's commitment to developing game-changing technologies could result in a real strategic surprise. And then now with Burn-In, looking at the blind spots that we're developing around the absolutely powerful wave that's coming right at us in terms of AI and everyday robotics for transforming our economy, our society, our political system. And that, of course, has huge implications for our military and those of our allies as well. You know, when you start to really kind of embrace this change and see it as something that is certain to come, even if we already are seeing, I think, a fairly decent preview of it in the coronavirus context. You know, the radical shift to working from home in a matter of days and weeks for large swaths of the society, including students, is extraordinary. You know, telemedicine is another domain where the leap from a conventional approach to healthcare to something altogether out of the realm of science fiction with telemedicine and other forms of synthetic, healthcare, it's like the kind of acceleration you couldn't have predicted with any other of the conventional foresight metrics. And so this idea that we are going to be able to predict any one of the futures that are ahead for us, when we are going to be at that point, when we are sending, for example, sailors out to sea aboard a ship that is in fact helmed or guided by an autonomous system and not actually a human captain or officer. That to me is really the realm, of course, of somewhat of a fantastical view of say, naval combat, naval operations, but it is incumbent on us to start to do that work now to anticipate what that might actually be like. So we're ready to fully capture, I think, both the human dimension of it in terms of the challenges, but also the opportunities. Where can we actually make these futures work for us? If you think about the Jack Aubrey character from Patrick O'Brien's Master and Commander, who was an exceptional sailor, exceptional warrior, and it was absolute shambles with his life ashore. I think that dichotomy is really important to think about, that for as much as the Navy is going to be focused on the maritime mission, the surface mission and the undersea mission, the air missions, that understanding what's going on in American society and other countries around the world is going to be critical, because we are entering, and I think we're getting, again, this glimpse of it right now, even in the last few days and week, of incredible foment and turmoil that is going to be essentially accelerating because of the coronavirus pandemic, bringing this forward sooner. But many of the larger trends around automation and workforce transformation that are not adequately backstopped by a kind of civil society or a social contract that can account for in America, where 40% of its population isn't working and they want to. And so this idea of being able to balance both the strategic vision for a fighting force that is, of course, rooted in a society that is going to see major swings in terms of what the federal government is going to be asked to pay for, I think is incumbent on some of the really, I think, baseline goals of, say, a 355 ship Navy by 2034. The idea that can remain intact as we imagine it today is, I think, a far greater stretch than most people appreciate. And when I think about the concept too of some of these metrics, which are in many ways very backward looking in the conception of naval operations, this 355 ship number, why not, rather than try to fight for every single hull, add a whole zero to it, so that you're talking about thousands of vessels that don't look or operate like those of the 20th century. And to me, this sort of a cultural break with past and tradition is exceptionally important, but it's also one of the biggest challenges that you might face in kind of the larger defense complex in the U.S. for the political and the commercial reasons that go with that. But that's the sort of radical thinking, I believe, that is going to be really important to kind of coming up with a fighting force that can fulfill a very sci-fi vision of operational concepts that will feel familiar at times, but will also feel like we are in the realm of something that is wholly uncomfortable and unfamiliar. And that, in fact, I think is the point. The realistic approach in the way that we look at these futures is also critical. If I think about the ways that I've tried to explore this in some of the short stories I've written, even in bigger projects like Ghost Fleet, it's really trying to unpack what are our most closely held assumptions. And how can I contest those? And can I do that authentically in the way that an adversary would? Because it feels to me like the more credibility we can give to adversaries, especially in the great power context, the better a chance we have at actually weathering the sorts of tactics and strategies that they're likely to throw at our country writ large. This idea of, for example, the balance between the manpower requirements of a modern fighting ship in the year 2020 and the amount that the Navy and Congress want to spend on it, clearly is out of whack. The GAO had a really interesting report, and I thought they encapsulated it really well. This is like a 2017 report, but they said, the Navy's process to determine manpower requirements, the number and skill mix of sailors needed for its ships, does not fully account for all ship workload. It's a very simple sentence, but it is so critical in understanding how we're going to develop a relationship at sea with machines. What are the jobs that we want to retain for humans, and what are those that we want to offer to software or robotics themselves? And this slow transition to this hybrid type maritime force can't be done with a half measure. It is the sort of approach that I think is equivalent to understanding the era of platform dominance is, of course, over, right? Software driven capability is going to be the best baseline for understanding an order of battle, if you will, in the future, not counting hulls or counting airframes. And that's a really difficult aspect too to get your head around, but something that sci-fi is so well suited for. And when you think about some of the lessons learned in the fictional realm that we've seen, taking a very utilitarian approach to technology, of course, helps, I think, characters really be able to see the world as it is, not as everybody else wants it to be. And though I, can sound somewhat dystopian in saying all of this, I do believe that being aware that everybody's, got a different version of what utopia is for one, but secondly, that one person's utopia is certainly another's dystopia. And yet I also feel it's incumbent on us, for those who really want to imagine these futures, that we don't create a sort of learned helplessness in thinking about what's ahead. This notion of agency is especially important when you think about the human machine and human software relationship, because we are raising our children in an app-driven world where they do not have a lot of direction and control over how they shape and model what their own algorithms and kind of their human self-determination look like. And yet at the same time, I want to be able to create something that, if it's read, allows people to say, that's a future I want to avoid, or there's an element there that I can see already present and coming true, and I need to do something about it. That aspect of it is, I think, critical in thinking about how we write. The other, and I'll kind of wrap up on this note, is that encouraging people to spend more time writing fiction. It is incredibly worthwhile, even if it is the sort of work that doesn't necessarily go anywhere else but your own hard drive.
No problem.
What you're doing is you're allowing your creative forces to be applied to very practical problems that we all ruminate on day in and day out. And I think that is the sort of work that creates patterns of creativity that can be applied well beyond the page. And there's another aspect too. So for the very tribal community that we're in this very innovative, I think, forward-looking group of people concerned about national security, in the coming decades, fiction is a great form of almost connective tissue. It's a common language. The fact that we can hear some of the talks tonight and know exactly what everyone is talking about speaks, I think, to that cultural connection, that it's critical, and also not only for us here, but also as we reach out to more people who are trying to bring into that fold, because good ideas, of course, can come from anywhere around the world these days, from any communities, and we really do need to be mindful of that for our own desire to be at the forefront, but also mindful of how our adversaries are sourcing, whether it's software or whether it's engineers. So I'll wrap up on that note, but thank you again for the chance to speak to you all from the bottom of my heart. This is a real honor, and I look forward to the rest of the talks this evening.
August, thanks a lot. It's good seeing you again. And for our audience, if you haven't seen on chat, just to let you know, there's a weather front coming through DC. We lost one of our folks who was heading into their office to do their presentation later. But if we lose a couple of our presenters, what we're going to do is just move forward with the next folks, because we are distributed. So there's an advantage to a distributed network. Second, there was a question on bios. If you go to NavyCon2020 to the US Naval Academy Museum's website, you'll see bios on all the speakers. And our next speaker is Jennifer Marland. Jennifer, you up?
I am up, but I am brought to you by lantern light and battery backup. So let's see how this goes. Nope.
We see your screen. Good.
Do you see my slides?
We do.
Fantastic.
It's all yours.
Okay. Why? Okay. So a Navy is essential for your planet. My required disclaimer saying that these are my views and not the departments of the Navy or its components, but why would it be? Because I'm not talking about the US Navy's history. I'm talking about the fictitious history of the wars between the Bahrainian and Setagandan empires that provide the framework for the majority of the books of Lois Master Bajold's Vocoverse. This award-winning series currently has 17 books and 5 short stories published between 1986 and 2018. So some background. The planet Barrier was colonized by 50,000 colonists from a future Earth around 300 years before the First Setagandan War. Soon after the colonists arrived, the wormhole pathway that expedited their travel collapsed, leaving the colonists to themselves and cut off from the galaxy. This lost planet was rediscovered through a different wormhole jump pathway through Kamarian space. Once again, in communication with the galaxy, BAR was just starting to get used to this new technology. They were fielding ambassadors to the major planets. And then the Comarians decided they wanted to invade. Timeline of the conflicts. So hopefully you all can see my little cursor. Here is the wormhole nexus, and here is Barriar. The Setagandan Empire, as I understand it, is in orange, and I should say that any mistakes in this are entirely mine and not represented by either the will of the author or my source material in creating this nexus map. So the Setagandan Empire decides they want Barriar. They pay off Comar to allow safe passage through their space and occupy Barriar for about 20 years. The Baranians were not excited about becoming part of the Setagandan Empire and violently resisted. After great losses on both sides, Setaganda decided that Barriar was not worth the effort and retreat. Once again independent, Barriar started rebuilding, and this included the development of a unified military with a strong space navy that would provide assurance that their planet would never be invaded again. 50-ish years after the end of the First Setagandan War, Barriar launched their mighty navy to take control of Comar, the place that allowed them to be invaded in the first place, to ensure that their homeworld would not be invaded again. Leading this invasion was Barriar's top strategist, who publicized that after Comar was part of the Baranian Empire, the tariffs for transiting through their nexus points would be reduced from 25 to 15%. As predicted, the galaxy recognized Comar as part of the Baranian Empire and enjoyed pocketing the tariff reduction. Winning the hearts and minds of the people of Comar is a subject for a different talk. In addition to moving their defensive perimeter against the Setagandan expansion, Comar provided Barriar
We're going to wait just about 10 seconds to see if that power is just a glitch on Jennifer's side. All right, our apologies. Yeah, like I said, we've got a weather front coming through the DC area and a few presenters are being affected. So while that happens, we're going to shift over to the next pre-recorded message.
So the question is, why is it legitimate to study science fiction? For sailors, this is an easy question to answer. Regardless of their academic background, sailors exist in a world defined and surrounded by technology. It is only natural that someone with a love of the sea and the stories she creates would be attracted to science fiction. Good fiction provides an escape from reality, and science fiction has the ability for the audience to escape the limitations of today's speed, time, distance, and landscapes. It takes the plausible and makes it real, the fanciful normal. Though the mechanics and technology may be new, science fiction rhymes with the present just enough to create a structure that is familiar. Around that structure, the author can tell stories and place personalities that any sailor will recognize as being familiar to their personal place and time. In these stories, we can explore the personal, moral, tactical, or strategic issues we otherwise can't. So much of what happens at sea or deployed is either classified, has ramifications in international relations, counters established policies, or wrapped up in politics, both real and interpersonal. that can put individual careers, reputations, or even lives at risk. All these barriers warp nonfiction storytelling to an extent that authors often pull their punches, and their stories devolve one chop chain or staff socialization at a time into little more than an industry press release or PAO July 4th photo essay. Science fiction, for both the producer and the consumer, provides an outlet to think about, recognize, and share what otherwise is hidden in the conflicting priorities of our reality. For me, you can find this dynamic in one of the best science fiction series of the last decade, The Expanse. This series is more than just entertaining science fiction, at least for this sailor. What hooked me in the first season was I saw, as you often do in good science fiction, stories that rhymed with things I spent over a decade writing and talking about, and in that less artful way into a much smaller audience on my blog and in my podcast. I found myself seeing a demonstration of what happens when you, for instance, have such an unbalanced fleet that you are forced to have one of your capital ships do simple law enforcement patrols, allow complacency and arrogance lead you to underestimate your enemy, get comfortable with peacetime optimal manning compromises to save a bit of change now, leading to tragic consequences at war later. And more personally, with everyone's favorite Martian, Alex Kamal, we find a retired middling naval officer trying to find place and meaning in a universe when neither work or family seems to fit quite the way he always thought they would. Fiction, while an escape, also gives the reader or viewer a chance to look inward, if not for answers, then at least for more questions to ask while trying to figure the real world out. Oh, and science fiction has, well, space, aliens, interesting things to contemplate doing in zero-G, and an ongoing thread of what-ifs, unbound from all the messy limitations we find while solving the inscrutable details of our own banal existence.
Thanks to Commander Salamander. And Jennifer, are you back? Do you have power again?
No power, but I'm on my phone so I can talk, and if I move this around, I might be able to still share my slides.
Okay.
Where did I drop out? Claude, when did I drop out?
You dropped out after was it the third slide?
Okay. So how do I turn this around? And I can't do that.
Lower.
Okay.
Should be something on your lower right screen. Perfect.
Right screen. I was trying to flip around these. Okay. So hopefully this isn't too bad. Bizarrely, this is actually represented in the Vorkosigan series by Miles in A Way to Break into a Secure System. So it's entirely appropriate. I'm using this knowledge now. So we have Barriar that has taken over Komar. They find a planet on the way to Escobar, and that they later named Sergyar. And this prompts an expansionist force to try to take over Escobar too, because Setaganda has a very large empire. Why shouldn't Barriar? This was a very bad idea, in part because the people of Beta Colony come to the aid of Escobar and bring with it their wonderful technology. So the Escobarian invasion was a lot of after effects, including the restriction of Barrier and military forces largely to their space and their sphere. So Barrier concentrates on largely domestic matters until, except for the Third Setagandan War, which again is a space war that doesn't touch down on any planet and is over very, very quickly. Now, keep in mind, Iranian naval forces at this time, Uganda has a much more, typically some of their navy is all spread out, allowing the Bahrainians to concentrate their forces and push back the Setagandan advances. So outside of providing an escort function to some merchant and shipping convoys, the Bahrainian fleet post-Escobar is confined to their location, and they have no way of counteracting the Comorian interests. So much like my presentation, they are adapting and overcoming by enlisting the Dendari Free Mercenary Fleet as a sometimes secret and largely sometimes not so secret force that can travel places denied by the regular Navy and ensure that there is safe passage for trade ships and subjects traveling in sectors very far from the Bahrainian Empire. One such case is in the war for Hagen's Hub. Here's Hagen's Hub. And you have Vervain, where the Setagandans wanted to invade and take over and basically push through that territory to the hub and provide more access to the trade networks down here in Jackson's Hole and the whole bottom part of the map. So Barrier can't quite get there, but the Dendari Free Mercenary Fleet can. So the Dendari jump through the Hagen's Hub wormhole into Vervani's space, counter the Setagandan invasion long enough to allow a combined military forces of Barrier, Pol, and Ausland to forge an alliance, join forces, and get permission to jump through. The aftermath of this was Barrier was able to gain additional transit points and some political alliance, but so expand into the territory on the right side of the map. The Setagandans look for territory on the left side of the map, and that comes to Little Marlac. Marlac gets invaded, and there's a staunch resistance. The resistors are transported from that planet and imprisoned on Dragula 4 over here. Now, Dragula, Barrier can't get there. No way. Too much purple in between here and here. So what do? They send in the Dendari in secret to rescue a leader who was imprisoned there, but the leader died before they could break him out. So instead, they break out the entire camp. Halting the now freed former POWs go back to Marlac, regain their planet, throw off the Setagandans. Oop. Almost the end. And suddenly, that's back in their control. So, using the Dendari Free Mercenary Fleet as a sometimes overt, but mostly covert force multipliers, Barrier is able to oppose Setagandan expansion, ensuring the freedom to travel and trade throughout the Nexus. So, this great power conflict between Barrier and Setaganda, in addition to providing a backdrop for the protagonist's adventures, illustrates the importance of geography and trade routes to understanding the actions of these two empires. So what are our takeaways from this fictitious history? Geography matters. History matters. And a well-led Navy is essential to defend your interests. Thank you so much for your patience, and back to you, Claude.
Jennifer, you get the gold star for adapting and overcoming in a very, very quick time. Our next presenter is Clara Engle, and she should be safe from lightning storms. Is that right, Clara?
Yes, I am not in the middle of a lightning storm. So theoretically, the only thing you'll deal with is my slow internet connection. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me. This evening, I'll be speaking about Babylon 5 and international relations theory. I am glad to be presenting virtually, so I didn't have to put on my encounter suit. I could stay at home. As a note before I dive in, Babylon 5 spans many seasons and many plot lines. International relations theory is broad and complex. I have been given about 12 minutes to speak, one of which I already used with a bad Vorlon joke. One additional note, the views I present in the next 11 minutes are mine alone. They do not represent the views of the Department of Commerce. In the television series Babylon 5, viewers are introduced to a future not too distant from today, where Earth is one of many worlds with sentient life. This series explores the complex relationships between the most powerful nations in the interstellar political system: the Earth Alliance, the Narn regime, the Centauri Republic, the Vorlons, and the Minbari. It focuses in particular on the titular space station, Babylon 5. The station was built to promote international peace through trade and dialogue in a neutral setting. Babylon 5's mission is a diplomatic one, and as the universe built in the series crumbles around the main characters, viewers begin to understand how the different ambassadors on the station interact and how those relationships are at the core of the conflict and the eventual resolution of the Shadow War. When Babylon 5 opens, the Narn and Centauri are at peace. They had fought for many years over the Centauri enslavement of the Narn people and exploitation of their planets. Eventually, the Narn built up enough strength to resist the Centauri successfully and defeated them. Now both races are members of the Babylon 5 Advisory Council, a collection of ambassadors from the most powerful races in known space, and through their ambassador to the council, the Narn and Centauri, along with the Earth Alliance and Minbari and Vorlons, agree, at least implicitly, to a set of intergalactic norms around the use of naval force. How then, in 1 year, do these norms erode to the point where the Narn and Centauri are actively at war with each other? Moreover, was there any diplomatic or military action that other members of the council, also active participants in the system of norms, could have taken to preserve it over time? I postulate that the decline of a centralized state, paired with the rise of powerful individual agency and the use of a previously unknown superweapon, lead to the erosion of norms on an interstellar scale, and that despite the attempts of other individuals or naval forces, these combined factors were too strong for the existing norm paradigm to contain. The Narn and Centauri introduce an interesting question of what happens when the assumed state-based building blocks of the system upon which norms are founded begin to erode, exposing the substrate of an individual or small collection of individuals. How can other governments or regimes respond to this challenge and build out a plausible response using national forces like navies? To understand this, it is important to first look at the erosion of the Centauri Republic over a period of approximately 1 year. The Centauri government transitions from being strongly emperor-bound to at best an illiberal government and at worst a failed state, with competing factions hoping to take power. To understand the individual's potential to effect such a transition, we can look to the Centauri ambassador of Babylon 5, Londo Mollari. There's a very helpful picture for those of you who are not familiar with what a Centauri looks like. In Midnight on the Firing Line, the first episode of the series, Londo, in center, receives news from Centauri Prime of an attack on the Centauri agricultural colony on Ragesh 3. He is particularly disturbed because he had previously used his influence to get his nephew placed there, theoretically out of harm's way. However, the agricultural colony was attacked by the Narn with the supposed justification that the colonists were having a difficult time suppressing protests, and they reached out to the Narn for help. Londo is distraught that this happened, both because of the attack on his people and because his nephew was unable to return home due to Londo's actions. Here we can see Londo thinking as an individual first, and when he goes to the council against his government's orders to request sanctions against the Narn, he is blocked by Jakar. Jakar is the Narn, not the human on the screen, the Narn ambassador. Londo is irate at both his own government's inaction and the international system designed to uphold norms around peace and the use of military force. He also desires vengeance against the Narn. Londo contemplates killing Jakar himself, but is blocked at the last minute by Babylon 5's security chief. This This thirst for vengeance is a theme that repeats throughout the series, and crucially, it diverts the individual from thinking about the collective good or buying into interstellar norms, and from acting in what is usually seen as a rational manner. Instead, it places the desires of the helm, which leads to an erosion of norms over time. Later in the series, Londo receives an offer from an agent known only as Morden, who promises him the use of a powerful naval force anytime he asks for it. This power is such that Londo can effectively take over any planet or beat any conventional force currently in operation. This shadowy naval force is, for all intents and purposes, a superweapon at the time of its introduction. As the Centauri Republic edges closer to becoming a failed state, with the looming death of the Emperor, Londo joins an irredentist group of Centauri interested in returning the Republic to its perceived former glory in the galaxy. This Centauri faction finds its power in the control over military force that they exert. Notably, Londo's demonstrations of his ability to control a superweapon helps the faction in their aim to inspire the Centauri citizenry and take over control of the government. The Centauri military and the are used here not in a traditional warfighting role, but rather as emblems of national pride for the Centauri regime. Interestingly, their Narn counterparts treat their military in much the same way. In terms of the role that the Navy can play and as a signaling force or power, these early examples of the Centauri military, or rather its new weapons, appearing in small numbers but creating vast destruction, brings up the question of how a Navy can signal a state's intentions or resolve problems with its presence. Perhaps the most significant episode of the series in this regard is The Coming of Shadows, which examines not only the use of the military force and technology in the Centauri regime, but also the way in which peer regimes utilize force for diplomatic endeavors. In this episode, the Centauri Emperor is planning a visit to Babylon 5 despite his ill health. That's him in the picture, in case that wasn't clear enough. Jakar, upon hearing the Emperor will be coming, speaks with his government about killing the Emperor, thereby removing what the Narns perceive to be the locus of Centauri power. Meanwhile, Londo and his co-conspirators have a different plan for the Emperor's arrival. They intend to first use military force to take over the Narn colony close to the Centauri homeworld, and then they plan to deliver a speech that paints the Emperor as out of date for the times, a relic of the past. John Sheridan, the commanding officer of Babylon 5, comes up with a plan to threaten the Centauri with the presence of Earth Navy observers to ensure the Centauri are treating the Narn properly. The result of this plan is that the Centauri, unwilling to let outsiders into their squabble with the Narn, release the Narn prisoners they had been keeping. Perhaps most interesting in this episode is the role the threat of naval force played in changing diplomatic outcomes. While it was not enough to prevent war from breaking out, arguably in this case because of the length of time it took for any intervention to occur, this threat, delivered without the actual support of the Earth government, was enough to change the outcome of an initial Narn-Centauri dispute. In part, it worked because the actions were all taken at an individual level instead of government to government. Each of the governments represented in the Babylon 5 Advisory Council, with the exception of the Vorlons, who remain deeply mysterious, are mired in internal struggles about who holds true power or the direction the government wants to take moving forward. Thus, much of the diplomacy and signaling is done on the individual level aboard Babylon 5, rather than between governments from their homeworlds. In the international relations paradigm, it is assumed that each of these ambassadors are rational actors who are making the most advantageous choices, including, in one case, moving rapidly towards war. The individual choice available to each member of the council is particularly apparent in this episode, when Jakar contemplates killing the Centauri Emperor, but is encouraged by Babylon 5's Captain Sheridan to open dialogue with him instead. Sheridan works with Jakar to enforce norms of diplomatic behavior and norms around peace and dialogue, rather than allowing him to respond to the Emperor's presence irrationally. If even a single individual goes against established norms for their own personal gain, as with Londo's revenge, then norms may begin to disintegrate. Babylon 5 provides an interesting way to examine the questions of norm erosion within an international system, and in particular, it helps demonstrate that navies can play a role in at least slowing the deterioration of norms. This is all very well and good in space and in 2259, but what about Earth in 2020? In the Taiwan Straits, the US Navy plays an important role in deterring action from an authoritarian state, China. There, China, which is arguably part of the international system and agrees to abide by laws and norms, including the laws of the sea, has demonstrated an increased willingness to move Chinese vessels into contested waters under the guise of protecting national interests. Londo and his cronies are similarly bent on protecting national interests in the Narn Centauri conflict, and to do this they utilize military force to meet their goals. Once the Centauri take over the Narn colony, the only thing that kept them from enslaving all the Narn residing there was the threat of an external naval presence. In the Taiwan Straits area and the South China Seas today, the US Navy plays a similar role in deterring continued Chinese encroachment into shared spaces through freedom of navigation operations, exercises in the region, and other displays of commitment. Navies play a critical role in preventing further norm erosion, always to an extent shaped by political realities. Babylon 5 provides a unique lens through which we can study international relations today. The role of individual actors in the international system is becoming increasingly studied, and by being able to examine not just the actions that Londo takes, but also those of Jakar and Sheridan, we can better understand the impact of a single individual and what their impact can be on the norms of the whole system. Moreover, military force continues to have major impact and will for the foreseeable future of the human race. In Babylon 5, military force is represented as one of several policy tools, not just a bludgeon. Exploring novel interpretations of how force is balanced in relation to norms helps us understand where navies can contribute in maintaining international order. Thank you very much, and back to you, Claude.
Thanks, Clara. Great job. And Randy, you are up. How's the power? Are you okay over there?
We're fine here. Thanks very much, Claude. I appreciate it. And just let me get my slides up. I apologize for I'm a historian. I'm used to working with text, and I'm afraid that my presentation is going to seem very old school to all of you, but I do hope that you don't mind something that's just about text with a few images. Please, my name's Randy Papadopoulos. I'm Secretary of Historian for the Department of the Navy, but as my opening slide says, please note that these are my views, not those of the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, or the United States government. What I'm going to try to do tonight is talk about two science fiction stories that were written actually over 75 years ago, or actually about 70 years ago and 80 years ago, and relate them with one little sidetrack to how great power competition and navies really are what we should be studying when we think about great power competition. I hope that you'll find that these stories are illuminating. They're really quite interesting to me. They're ones that I read when I was a teenager, but they've stuck with me. And I really am having a great time listening to the other presenters and also taking part in the discussion this evening. So thank you very much for your attention. The first place is actually with the detour I mentioned to you before, and it relates to a novel written about 113 years ago by H.G. Wells, who's a very noted, very renowned science fiction writer. They didn't call it science fiction at that time. It was called something else, but he wrote The War in the Air. And you can see the outline basically of the story here as it relates to tonight's topic. In this, there's a naval battle between the Imperial German Navy and US Navy dreadnoughts off of the Virginia coast. And in fact, the Americans are starting to win, even though they're outnumbered, but the Zeppelins intervene and drop their dragonflies, the Drachenflieger that you see there, which are small attack craft which completely annihilate the US fleet. After that, the Zeppelins go on to destroy New York and prompt a global air war which ends industrial civilization on planet Earth. I draw your attention to this and to the picture of H.G. Wells, who was taken about the time that he wrote this novel, because it really is the earliest example I can find of technological outflanking. The idea that technology in a great power competition, although really this isn't about great power competition in this particular story, but what aviation does and what Wells is arguing is that aviation will make navies and armies obsolete. And that's the type of story that I think really doesn't help when we're discussing a great power competition, because one of the things about great power competition is that it typically relates to powers that can overthrow one another and in a symmetrical way. Near peer competitors are not going to be overthrown by something simple. Where this analogy does work, I think, is if you're talking about something very specific like cyber. Cyber could potentially make it impossible for a navy to do something, but it's not necessarily going to invalidate a fleet completely. I think that's something that might be seen, at least from a historian's perspective, which is what I am, as being alarmist. Well, let's talk about the first of tonight's two authors that I really want to focus on. That's Isaac Asimov. And I noticed that Larry Ferrero drew attention to the fact that Isaac Asimov and Theodore Sturgeon and Robert Heinlein, they're from right to left in that photograph, all worked at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in 1944. They're all famous science fiction writers. In fact, they all had a Navy connection. Asimov most loosely. Robert Heinlein was a former naval officer who had to leave the service because he contracted tuberculosis in the 1930s. But Asimov, as you can see from his biography here, was actually a trained chemist and went on to write a great number of books indeed. I look at his productivity of titles, 500 books in his lifetime. And he didn't die that old. And you realize that he was a really prodigious writer indeed. Well, the story I want to talk to you about tonight is called The Black Friar of the Flame. To be blunt, I have to apologize, first of all, for the copy of the cover that I included here from Planet Stories, which is really not, well, it was the way science fiction was marketed in the 1940s. It's really very much a period piece. But I think you have to note that Isaac Asimov was not particularly fond of this story, but he was not fond of it for a couple of very specific reasons. Most importantly, he wrote it when he was 21 years old. And so it's one of his earliest stories. It also went through an extensive editing process that really did not make him feel very comfortable. But you can see the universe it posits at that time. The galaxy is dominated by two major powers, humans and the reptilian Lazanu. They're an empire based at the star Vega. And a Lorist pilgrim, a quasi-religious character named Philip Sanat, learns that the Lazanu plan to restart the war that led them 2,000 years earlier to conquer Earth, and they're going to conquer humanity. They're going to cleanse Earth of all human beings, and they're going to replace the humans, who are much more numerous, in fact, with their own dominion across the galaxy. Philip Sanat finds out about this, starts a rebellion, and proceeds to liberate most of Earth, not all of it, but builds an interstellar coalition of humans to try to overthrow the Lazanu. And the two fleets concentrate at the climax of the book off of Earth and at Vega. By the way, the quotation I just put up is taken from two of the Lazanu who are playing a game of cards. And one of them notes that, in fact, the position that they're facing is that they're facing a numerically superior enemy, hopelessly divided amongst itself. And this is a key thing that Asimov is going to emphasize, the politics that are playing a role in the human resistance to the Lazanu. Black Friar of the Flame has one big naval battle in it, and it's modeled on a real naval battle, in fact. Given that Asimov was writing in the early 1940s, he really didn't have the Second World War to use as a reference, so he went back a lot farther to the Battle of Salamis 2,500 years ago between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. It's interesting that our host tonight, Claude Berube, has actually reenacted Salamis using midshipmen paddling kayaks at the Naval Academy. So I think there's an odd circle playing out in front of you now. But you can see what happens with this battle. Sanat plays a bit of treachery on his own side and gets the Lazanu to capture the lunar base, which is much more powerful. So the humans are surrounded, and the humans now have to fight. Notice what Asimov emphasizes. He says geography matters because, as I point out here, planetary weapons are much more powerful. So the humans are, in essence, on the wrong side of a choke point, and they're in trouble. So they have to fight. In addition, Asimov addresses some of the tactics that are involved. The offense of all of the starships on both sides are roughly symmetrical, as are the defenses, so that each ship has an individual protective screen it has to drop in order to use its weapons. And if you can time your firing on the enemy ship so that it's got its screen down, you can destroy him. And in fact, that's what happens at the climax of the battle, really. The humans are outnumbered, they're surrounded. The formations of both sides are spheres. Asimov was enough of a scientist to understand how the physics would work, and he gives them a pretty good idea of how the battle should operate. In the end, however, skill matters more. Sanat destroys the enemy flagship, he hates the reptilian admiral, and human ship handling, plus their tactical innovation of putting a ram, it's called the needle, that literally lets them ram starships into one another, wins the battle both at Earth and at Vega. Notice that Asimov mentions that the battles at the capital systems are what count. In other words, the fleets in both cases are influencing events on planets. This is exactly the same type of thing that navies do with influencing events ashore in our real world. And with this type of technological equality, with a peer competitor and great power competition, you're dealing with fleets that have to fight one another pretty much on even terms. Let's talk about the next author, Sir Arthur C. Clarke. His biography is there too. You'll notice that he too is trained as a mathematician and a physics major after the Second World War. He's in the Royal Air Force during the conflict. His most famous, his most groundbreaking event of his career is probably publishing a paper on geostationary satellites in 1945. He doesn't invent the idea of geostationary satellites, but he comes up with a good way of popularizing it. He goes on to write 40 books, including 2001, A Space Odyssey, a major work that of course became a very fine science fiction film too. His short story is entitled Superiority. And this is written from a very interesting perspective. The narrator of that story is an imprisoned Grand Admiral of a stellar fleet. We don't really know much about the two sides in the war that he describes in his story, but the two sides are obviously from the technologically roughly equivalent. We don't know if they're human or if they're alien. That's not clarified. The names are changed a little bit. They look a little human. Certainly the reactions behave like human beings. But the great power competition that he's describing is very much one that's sort of anonymous. In any event, the Grand Admiral is writing to say, we had all the advantages at the start of this war. We were tactically equal to our enemy, but we had more numbers. We were better professionally speaking. Our tactical skills were better. We had better allies until a setback, or at least a narrower victory than they thought. And they go to their Professor General, who is the head of the research staff. And he asks a question that really nobody in the professional military has an answer to. Are we sure the enemy can't overthrow us with some sort of a radical new weapon? And he forces his side, the narrator's side, to turn to technology. And the quotation that I include here, what we want are new weapons, a revolution in warfare. For those of you who study the Department of Defense and know about the revolution in military affairs or transformation, you'll see some very unusual parallels to what we were talking about 4 and 5 decades after this story was written. A revolution in warfare may be upon us. Well, in Superiority, the long-term space combat, because these battles take place over a couple of years, are really very important. The narrator side comes up with 3 very interesting weapons. A sphere of annihilation, which is a very powerful weapon that literally will destroy any ship in its path during the course of a battle. A battle analyzer, which is a very powerful combat calculator for tactical deployments. It's actually vacuum tube based. It's so big it takes a starship to run it. And an exponential field, which makes a spaceship invisible. Well, each one of these turns out to make things worse. Each one of them suffers teething problems. The sphere of annihilation, for example, can be activated inside a warship whenever it turns on its own radar. The battle analyzer has to be put on board an ocean liner because it takes 400 technicians to run it, and they need that much space. And when the enemy realizes that there's always an ocean liner accompanying the enemy fleet, they target them, and by their destruction, sow complete chaos in the narrator's fleet. Finally, the exponential field is so powerful, it does render spaceships invisible, but it also detunes them from the surrounding universe so much that replacement parts and weapons cannot be loaded onto them, making them even more ineffective. So ultimately, the enemy, which is still gaining small territory and some local victories, gets an idea that they're actually building some momentum, and they keep building standard ships and weapons. They exploit the weaknesses of these through weapon systems, and they gain the initiative, and ultimately, with some luck, they press the offensive to victory. In one of the concluding lines by Arthur C. Clarke, I think his words stand absolutely magnificently here. It really is amazing that their own side is crippled by their own technology. Now, Clarke is writing at a different time than Asimov. Asimov does not have the experience of World War II behind him. Clarke does. So Clarke has seen, and I think he's modeling what he tells in this story, very much on the German experience in the Second World War, where the Germans have introduced jet fighter planes and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and radically better submarines. And all of these things are in place, yet the Germans don't win. I think the fact that he makes his narrative character a Grand Admiral, the same as the head of the German Navy, during the Second World, the two heads of the German Navy during the Second World War, is perhaps the most telling point about this. Of course, Clark is also writing after the invention of the atomic bomb. And so he's definitely trying to make a point that technology without a user's manual, technology on its own is not the answer to a great power competition. And I think he makes this point with a very strong sense of humor as well. So to wrap up, why talk about navies in space and not air forces? I think that my biases are coming through pretty strongly here, but I'll start off by saying that H.G. Wells does not explain great power competition. As I said before, The War in the Air is about a very good gadget story. It's fun, it's a good story, but it's not about what we're talking about today. But I think Asimov gets to some interesting points. I think Asimov presents the interaction of interstellar fleets and planetary species, places that the two species he talks about live, just as navies influence events ashore. And here I'm channeling a very famous British naval theorist, Sir Julian Corbett, who wrote in the early part of the 20th century and made just that point. It's exactly what you want navies to do in a great power competition. Arthur C. Clarke is instead making the same a different argument, but he's talking about the complexity of a fleet, because fleets are very complex. They're probably the most complex organizations that human beings have ever created. And if you're talking about something that's trying to manage our era's challenges, as several of the speakers have mentioned already today, we need to not just have innovation, but we need to have a sustainable force or ready force, and also be adaptable, because quite often technology doesn't work the way you want it to, especially when you're facing a peer competitor in a great power competition. Therefore, to make my last point with both strategic utility and their complexity, a fleet models what space travel will be, what space wars will be, and what today's great power competition is. Thank you very much, and back to you, Claude.
Thank you very much, Randy. And we're going to turn over to Hugh Hewitt.
Friends of NavyCon, welcome. I'm Hugh. I'm a journalist from the civilian world. Now, you won't recognize the term journalist because you're science fiction fans. And in science fiction, they attempt to tell you something about the truth. So there's very little intersection between what I do and what you read. However, I was at the first NavyCon, back row, very far chair to the left, in the corner, wondering, what the hell are these people talking about? So after it was over, even the entertaining parts, I took aside Dr. Jerry Hendricks and Captain Mark Vandroff, and I said, what the hell are those people talking about? 14 hours later, I still had no idea what the hell you were talking about, but it was fabulously entertaining. So I'm hoping to be back. And if you turn around and look in the back row in the chair there in the back, I'll be there. That's the strategic chair. That's the chair from which no one can see that you don't have a clue about what the hell are these people talking about. Now, I did play Risk as a child, and recently I've taken to asking on my radio show Mark Zuckerberg, various United States senators, Secretary of Defense Esper, other people, whether or not they played Risk as a child, because I think there's a big correlation inside the Beltway and the civilians who played Risk, who would like to play Risk in real life. And it turns out my theory is right. I believe there's a big correlation between those of you at the Naval Academy and those who watch Star Trek, Star Wars, or Star Trek-y Wars, as Kurt Schlichter would call it. No matter where you come from, no matter how much little or less of little you know, I know that NavyCon is great fun, and so I'll talk to you afterwards, but please keep it a little bit shorter than Hendricks and Vandroff did. Welcome to NavyCon.
And Thomas, over to you.
Thanks, Claude. Let's get this fired up. Welcome, everyone, to the galaxy far, far away. On the docket tonight is Star Wars. Hooray! And the law. I can hear the digital boos right now, and if rotten fruit could be thrown through the computer, I would be feeling that right now. With a JAG, yay. With an Army JAG, I know what you're all thinking right now. And trust me, I feel the vibe, but it's okay, because tonight we're going to be talking about my favorite Star Wars movie as a kid, Return of the Jedi. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Endor, the sort of culminating event at the end of that movie. And in the Battle of Endor, the setup is, as we all know, the Empire has built the bigger, badder version of the giant floating war crime in space that was just destroyed 2 movies ago by the Rebel Alliance. It's protected by a planet-based shield generator, and so the Rebel Alliance sends a strike team of Special Forces soldiers to destroy that shield. Meanwhile, the ragtag Rebel fleet assembles and moves in for a surprise attack to destroy the Death Star. Now, the elephant in the room about this movie was brought out, or about this battle was brought out in the 1994 movie Clerks. And if you haven't seen it, that's okay, because the gentleman with the backwards hat there, Randall, sets it up pretty perfectly for us, this conundrum. What do we know about the first Death Star in A New Hope? Well, by the time the Rebel Alliance destroyed it, and specifically, if we're going to give credit where credit is due, Luke Skywalker, it was a completed battle station. It was manned by the Imperial military, the Army and Navy, headed by a religious zealot / military leader, Darth Vader, some Imperial brass, and a whole lot of Imperial stormtroopers. The second Death Star, as Star Wars is so often creative and unique, is much the same, a lot bigger, same religious zealot at the head, some different Imperial brass that didn't get blown up in the first Death Star, and a whole lot of other stormtroopers who also didn't get blown up in the first Death Star. But what's the distinguishing feature here? Well, it's that the second Death Star, by the time the rebels roll into Endor, is still under construction. It's not complete yet. And as Randall points out in that scene in Clerks, a job of that magnitude, a construction job of that magnitude, would have taken far more manpower than the Imperial Army or Navy had to offer. I mean, what do stormtroopers know about installing a toilet main? All they know is white armor and killing. To complete a job of that magnitude, they would have had to bring in somebody else, namely civilian contractors, independent contractors, and loads of them who could finish this job quickly and quietly and get this Death Star operational and out into the galaxy. All of a sudden, as these poor folks are just doing their jobs, a bunch of left-wing militants and their glorious Y-wing starfighters sweep in and blow the whole thing up, taking all those innocent lives with them, a bunch of casualties of a war that they had no part in, other than taking a juicy government contract to put food on the table for their families all around the galaxy. Now, if you're like me, there's a burning question that sits in your mind as you watch the Battle of Endor for the 400th or 500th time since you were a kid. Is it legal? And I realize as I say those words, I may be the only person that thinks that's in this audience, and that's probably an explainer as to why JAGs sit alone at the dining facility. But when we talk about the law of armed conflict, we're not talking about a single dusty old book or a single set of statutes. No, we're talking about a complex web, an interconnected web of international and customary law, treaties, regulations, and more. And if you're in the business, we call these things the sacred texts. And I realize that applying, the very thought of applying rules to something as chaotic and destructive as warfare seems completely oxymoronic. You may be sitting here right now thinking that it's ridiculous to try to apply the law of war, or really any law, to a franchise like Star Wars, where you've got a maniacal bad guy like Emperor Palpatine running around. But I submit to you that it matters, and how you fight and the rules that you fight under matter to these guys, the Rebel Alliance. Their entire mission is to overthrow an oppressive, destructive government that has wreaked havoc across the galaxy. And the act of stooping to the sort of wanton destruction and death that has been the hallmark of Emperor Palpatine and the Galactic Empire during its reign is completely counterproductive for the Rebel Alliance and would undercut their legitimacy and all of their goals that they're trying to apply or achieve. And when we get to the heart of the law of armed conflict, there are 4 key pillars, 4 principles that undergird all of the rules that govern how we fight: distinction, necessity, proportionality, and unnecessary suffering. We're going to talk about all but unnecessary suffering in the context of the second Death Star here. Now, distinction is a fairly basic concept. It's the obligation that when you use force, you must distinguish or differentiate between combatants and non-combatants. Now, non-combatants could be civilians. These are folks who enjoy the protection or a certain level of protection under the law of armed conflict, where they can't be intentionally or indiscriminately targeted. That means that while you might be able to open fire on stormtroopers, setting fire to Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru is a no-no. It also carries an obligation to distinguish between protected property and protected places. And Star Wars gives us some great examples that while you might be able to target Scarif Base with a military assault, as seen in Rogue One, burning up the Jedi Temple and all those awesome lightsabers within it, also a no-no. And that's a technical legal term that you can write down and take to the bar exam. The exception being Anakin Skywalker, who appears to be able to target Padawans, sand people, and actual sand with relative impunity. So I'm not sure, that might be another presentation. But if you find yourself asking, what about the politics? Don't these contractors know what they've gotten yourself into? You're not alone. In the scene in Clerks, the blue-collar roofer that approaches Randall and Dante makes just this point. He points out that in the real world, contractors know and understand the politics of the jobs that they're vying for. He makes an example out of a roofing job that he passed up because it was for a mob boss, and that the guy that eventually took that job, knowing full well who it was for, ended up getting killed as the mob boss got attacked. Well, isn't it the same for those Death Star contractors? They know that they're working for the Galactic Empire. They know they're working on the Death Star. Haven't they, in a sense, assumed the risk? Well, not exactly. Because under the law of armed conflict, civilians, even those civilians who might be operating in a war zone for one side or the other, they don't automatically lose that protected status. Unless they do something to take direct part in hostilities, they're going to be cloaked by that protection under the law of armed conflict. If you've deployed, if you've been to a place like Bagram Airfield or Kandahar Airfield in Afghanistan, think about the folks serving your meals. Think about those poor saps whose job it is to clean out the porta potties every single day. Those folks know that they're on NATO bases. They know the politics behind it. They know that there's an opposing side and that they're working for the other side. But they don't lose their protection just because they're operating on that base doing jobs like that. Likewise, those Death Star contractors, even though they're working for the big bad empire on the big bad Death Star, don't automatically lose their protection just because they're doing a job. So when it comes to targeting something as large as the Death Star, how do you make sure that you're killing these guys, the right guys, and not killing these guys? Unfortunately, the law of war recognizes that there are going to be innocent lives and innocent property lost in war. It's inescapable. The job of the law of armed conflict isn't to eliminate all innocent losses. It's to limit it as best as possible. And that's where necessity and proportionality come into play. Military necessity, whether you realize it or not, if you've seen A New Hope, you've seen a crystal clear example of military necessity thanks to Grand Moff Tarkin and his magnificent cheekbones. The core concept here is that military force has to be directed at legitimate military objectives. In Tarkin's case, in targeting Leia's home planet of Alderaan in A New Hope, he lays out exactly what military necessity isn't. By targeting a peaceful planet full of peaceful people who, as Leia points out, have no weapons whatsoever, he understands that he's not attacking a military target. He says it, whether you realize it or not. You'd prefer another target, a military target, than name a system. He's trying to make a point here, and destroying Alderaan is a point to the larger galaxy because he realizes that this is not a legitimate military objective. Now, when you ask about what makes a thing, an object, a legitimate military objective or target, it's something whose nature or use makes an effective contribution to military action. So it could be something like a tank, whose very inherent nature is to fight a war, to destroy things. It could also be something that is not inherently military in nature. Take the end scene in Saving Private Ryan, that final battle in the fictional town of Ramel in France, and the bridge that the battle centers around. That bridge is a civilian structure by nature. It services the town of Ramel, but it became a legitimate military target by virtue of the Germans' impending use of it to mount a counteroffensive on Allied forces following D-Day. Now, when it comes to the Death Star, and this is the moment where you're going to be very, very glad that you've got an expert like myself whose legal acumen is unmatched to be able to break down this analysis. When it comes to the Death Star and whether it's a legitimate military target, let's start on the deep end. Let's just dive right in and look at its name. The Star Wars is nothing if not subtle, and just the name itself sort of conveys and gets across exactly what this battle station is all about. And if there was any question about the Death Star's contribution to military objectives, Alderaan taught that lesson, as demonstrated here by this poor pumpkin, to the rest of the galaxy. This is a battle station built around a gigantic super laser who with one shot can obliterate an entire planet. And in the Battle of Endor, as the Emperor springs his trap and reveals that this second Death Star is fully armed and operational, the rebels learn again the hard way as the Death Star starts obliterating capital ship after capital ship. Now, necessity also requires that when you're talking about the total destruction of an object, that destruction has to offer a definite military advantage. The object here isn't to handcuff military forces, but it's to rein in the sort of unbridled, wanton destruction that we've seen in conflicts past. So, in other words, we don't want destruction just for destruction's sake. We want that military force tied to a military advantage. And when it comes to destroying the Death Star, you're talking about destroying a battle station that, when complete, will spell almost certain doom for the Rebel Alliance and will spell a similar doom for the galaxy at large. You're also talking about, and we're going to set aside any legal concerns about assassination, about the highest value military target and most wrinkly military target in the entire galaxy, as Emperor Palpatine is personally overseeing the final construction phases of this second Death Star. That all adds up to the second Death Star being a legitimate military target whose destruction offers a definite military advantage. That brings us to our last tenet, proportionality. And I want to start with what proportionality isn't, because there's a common myth that floats around that proportionality is this check on the types of weapons that a military force can use. In other words, you've got to match weapon for weapon. You may have heard the myth that you can't use a Mark 19 40 millimeter grenade launcher against an enemy infantry soldier, or you can't use a Star Destroyer to blow up the Millennium Falcon. That's not what proportionality is. It doesn't require that you scale the use of your weapons to match the target. Proportionality is a balancing test that requires you to weigh on one side the amount of collateral damage, in other words, the loss of civilian life, the destruction of civilian property, against the definite military advantage that you're getting out of that strike. That loss of that collateral damage cannot be excessive in relation to the military advantage gained. That's the check on things. That's the balance. And when you talk about destroying the second Death Star, wiping this thing out, obliterating it, is the only shot that the rebels have to survive in the Battle of Endor. As they approach this thing, there are no more conveniently placed thermal exhaust ports like there were on the first Death Star. And in fact, as Admiral Akbar tries to stage a retreat as the Death Star starts firing, Lando Calrissian points this out. He says, "We won't get another shot at this, Admiral. Once this Death Star is complete, it will be impenetrable. It will be indestructible. There will be no other option." And what that means for the Rebel Alliance is the end of their movement, the total destruction of their forces, and the rest of the galaxy being permanently put under the boot heel of the Galactic Empire. That's weighed against the near certainty that with a strike like that, you're going to kill hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent civilian contractors who are just there trying to put food on their tables back home. And when you weigh those two together, Billy D gives it away here, but it is a proportional strike. The rebels really are backed into a corner here. You've got to destroy this, and that's unfortunate for those contractors and really for Randall's argument in Clerks, but this is a lawful strike at the end of the day. I've got to get back to Jakku. I really appreciate everyone tuning in for this. Thanks for the opportunity, Claude. You can find me on Twitter or at the Legal Geeks. Thanks, Claude.
Thanks, Thomas. And Jonathan, you are up.
All right. That is a, man, go figure the other Army guy had to be outstanding at this. All right, give me just a minute, and here we go. All right. All right, good evening. My name is Jonathan Bratton. I'm a captain in the Army National Guard, and thank you so much for permitting a complete landsman such as myself to take part in this glorious naval operation. I assume, by the way, that we're all getting joint credit for this. That's why we're all here, I thought. But you know, I'll wait for a later time for that confirmation. As usual, you know, present the disclaimer. My views presented here do not represent the Department of Defense, although they do have to own the doctrinal terms that I use, and that's on them. All right, so, okay, in this presentation, I hope to show how Army-Navy joint operations can work successfully by highlighting one which, well, didn't. And I speak, of course, of the Imperial disaster at the Battle of Endor's Forest Moon, and the destruction of not only the second Death Star, but also the loss of Executor, Darth Vader's flagship, and also the lamentable loss of the late Fleet Admiral Firmus Piet. So in the next 10 minutes, I hope to demonstrate just how this loss could have been prevented through effective joint command of Imperial forces. All right, so as a reference throughout this talk, I'll refer you to a publication that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. You have it on your coffee tables, Joint Publication 3-14, Space Operations. To begin with, I'd like to remind you, not that anyone needs to be reminded, you all know, what this joint pub lays out, namely, quote, synergy throughout the operational environment is a prerequisite for effective joint operations. Every joint operation requires synchronization of capabilities throughout the operational environment to support the commander's intent and concept of the operation. Space capabilities must be thoroughly integrated into every aspect of joint planning long before operations begin, and lack of integration increases the fog and friction of war. Okay, so right off the bat, now I wish we could all imagine James Earl Jones reading that out. That would be, you know, we couldn't get him for this. We'll try to get him next time. But right off the bat, we have the necessity of joint operations being integrated and synergistic. All right, so we need to outline a few things, namely the makeup of the Imperial forces assembled for the Battle of Endor. And being the force structure and doctrine nerd that I am, we'll just call them Joint Task Force Palpatine. As you might guess, this JTF is named for its commander, Darth Sidious, also known as the Emperor Palpatine. It's that whole civ-mil relations thing. Is he military? Is he civilian? We don't know. So for this engagement, he's not only the commander, but also the primary strategist. And he is acting in a joint capacity with control over Imperial Army and Imperial Navy elements. He is assisted by his deputy commanding officer, the DCO, Darth Vader. Both individuals will, at times, endeavor to provide purpose, mission, and direction to the joint task force. Now, the Imperial Navy, I know that's what you're all here for, so I'll try to, really spend some time on the Navy. The Imperial Navy present at this engagement consists of a fleet of capital ships, Imperial Star Destroyers, attack cruisers, light cruisers, etc., as well as the usual swarm of fighters for support and attack roles. The fleet is under the overall command of Fleet Admiral Firmus Piet with his flagship in Executor, as you see gloriously here, the single Executor class ship present for the engagement. Piet has been given his orders from the JTF commander, assemble the fleet out of sight, and, on order, join the engagement once rebel forces have committed against the Death Star and contain them within the operational environment. Right away, he has been curtailed. His ability to seize the initiative is entirely gone. Oh, poor Admiral Piet. Now, things are even more out of joint, and yes, the pun is fully intended, on the land component commander side. The Joint Task Force commander states that he has a legion of his best troops protecting the key terrain that is the shield generator for the Death Star on Endor's Forest Moon. However, as is often the case after the destruction of a military force, historians have been stymied in identifying this force or its commander. DCO Vader was often given command of ground operations, but in this engagement, he is notably absent from the actual fight while removing a high-value target to take to the JTF commander, totally a thing that DCOs do, apparently. Commander Egar and Colonel Dyer share some responsibilities for ground defense, but neither was the overall land component commander. Now, what of the Legion's force itself? Well, at full strength, you've got 4 regiments inside a Legion, accounting for about 12,800 stormtroopers. I would be remiss as a historian if I did not note that this equates roughly to the strength of a U.S. Army Division's infantry contingent in 1918, minus, a whole bunch of sustainment troops. I would be, there are of course quite a few support elements to provide sustainment to the trigger pullers, but for now let's assume for medium strength, attrition being what it is with stormtroopers, you never know, regiments with light and heavy armor, and their mission for this force is to protect the shield generator, fully in line with protection of ground-based space assets. It's pretty cut and dried. But with no clear commander in place, it violates the venerable JP 3-14's dictum, quote, clearly defined command relationships are crucial for ensuring timely and effective execution of space operations. All right, well now that's gonna cause some problems. Okay, so we've got our forces arrayed, we've got our command elements more or less in place. Let's move on to the actual engagement of this JTF. The JTF commander's overall plan is to deny the enemy fleet freedom of maneuver by trapping it between the Death Star and the Imperial fleet. Thus immobilized, it can be destroyed by the Death Star's massive firepower. In the process, the JTF commander intends to turn the rebels' key leader, Luke Skywalker, a pilot of some middling abilities, to his own side. This overall mission is never shared with his key naval or ground component commanders, nor does he ever let them know that the Death Star is operational. Thus, there is no common operating picture when the engagement commences. This is a major fail if you're at JRTC or NTC. It's just, they're gonna give you a no-go the minute you set foot in there. All right, what is the overall goal? Whoops, went too fast on that one. Gave it away. Now, what is the overall goal of space operations? The venerable JP 3-14 states that it is to, quote, to ensure freedom of action in space for and when directed to deny an adversary freedom of action in space. The purpose of these operations is to achieve space superiority. Okay. Nothing in that joint pub about kidnapping the DCO's son and turning him to the dark side of the Force, or really about indoctrination in general. Joint publications really seem to glide over that. It's very strange. However, we can file this under psychological operations and put it under the fires category because, let's be honest, no one really knows what PSYOP does anyways. All right, so well, speaking of fires, Chapter 2, Paragraph 14 of JP 3-14 states that targeting and fires are synchronized through the Joint Targeting Coordination Board. Once the engagement begins and the rebel fleet is trapped between the Imperial fleet and the Death Star, only the JTF commander controls the principal weapon, the Death Star. Admiral Piet is left to watch and wonder from his flagship. At first, things go well. 2 rebel capital ships are destroyed by the Death Star, and Imperial fleet's fighters are able to cope with those of the enemy. However, the rebel fleet pulls what I like to call an Admiral Nelson. Never mind maneuvers, just go straight at him. Or less apocryphally, no captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of the enemy. Unquote. In an effort to avoid the fire of the Death Star, the rebel fleet closes with the Imperial fleet, denying the Death Star a clear shot at their cruisers. In this close-in fight of broadside versus broadside, the skill, daring, and outright fanaticism of the rebel pilots gives them an edge over their immobilized Imperials. Without any orders other than to remain in place, Piet is unable to maneuver his fleet to any advantage to the whole. Meanwhile, the ground situation, which began in a promising manner, spins entirely out of control when the rebel ground strike force is unexpectedly reinforced with an insurgent movement amongst the natives. What is that? That seems vaguely familiar. This insurgency is caused by Imperial aggressions against the natives, which could have been avoided had the JTF commander heeded JP 3-14, quote, partnerships can enhance collective security abilities and provide a deterrent effect against adversaries from attacking or interfering with friendly space capabilities, end quote. This insurgency completely pins the garrison legion into place and allows the rebels freedom of movement to seize the shield generator and rig it with explosives. At this key juncture, the JTF commander is entirely withdrawn from the battle and engaged with his own private mission. The DCO, as we see, is crossing swords with a high-value target. Thus, timely and effective space operations are completely halted. Both Imperial Navy and Army forces are locked in their own battles that have deviated exceptionally from their primary plan. No plan will survive first contact in any universe, and lack any type of guidance or commander's intent from the top, not to mention a complete breakdown in coordination in general. As if to make matters worse, the fleet commander's flagship is targeted by enemy fighters. One out-of-control A-wing smashes through the bridge of Executor, killing Admiral Piet and his top commanders instantly. We'll note that an A-wing did this, not a Y-wing. And sending the ship in a nosedive where she makes impact on the surface of the Death Star. Leaderless and unable to employ their primary weapon systems, the Imperial fleet falters. On the ground, the shield generator is destroyed, permitting the rebel exploitation force the freedom of maneuver to penetrate and destroy the Death Star's reactor. Simultaneously, the JTF commander is killed by the DCO, who intervenes to protect the high-value target, since blood is apparently thicker than force lightning. Much like Captain David Porter invading Spanish territory in the 1820s to protect one of his officers, only to get court-martialed by the US Navy, DCO Vader is willing to sacrifice his career for what he views is right. And yes, you just heard David Porter getting compared to Darth Vader. Where else but NavyCon, ladies and gents? Anyways, with the Death Star gone and all command and control lost, the Imperial fleet retreats in confusion, while the Legion on the Forest Moon is cut to bits by rebel ground forces and insurgents, sometimes even literally. Damn Ewoks. Because he failed to follow the fundamentals of joint space operations, JTF Commander Palpatine's operation was doomed from failure at the outset. There are a myriad of lessons to be learned from this operation. Commander's intent, key tasks, and an end state for the entire operation need to be fully understood by subordinate commanders. Joint operations only succeed if all capabilities are integrated and synergized. I love that word. No one knows what it means, but we love it. All commands should have contingency plans. And look, guys, like, you shouldn't entrust a religious maniac bent on his own purposes as your JTF commander. Thank you for listening. Hit me up with questions in the chat. And of course, may the joint force be with you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Ian Bully is up next.
Okay, let's get to it then. And can that be seen, Claude?
Yep, that's it.
All right, great. So, howdy everybody, as I'm contractually obligated to say. Sometimes it pays to shake the dust off works, academic and fictional, that were once popular but have since been surpassed. The latest trends are not always as new as they claim to be, and this is especially true in science fiction. Star Wars, Babylon 5, and the Green Lantern comics, as wonderful and unique as they each are, owe obvious debts to an oft-derided precursor, E.E. Doc Smith's Lensman series. Consisting of 6 books, originally published from 1937 to 1950, this was the first science fiction series conceived of as a series, and it set the tone for much of space opera to follow. While the original is best read with a thesaurus in hand, you've got to properly appreciate the wildly Coruscant displays of pyrotechnic splendor and the associated lambent bursts of violet fire. A host of poorly realized imitators have since diluted the impact of their progenitor. With that in mind, it pays to be specific in our dusting efforts. What can we learn about navies and great power conflict from Lensman that we can't from its imitators? Where Lensman makes a significant contribution is in its depiction of rapid technological development in an existential conflict between great powers. The series demonstrates the importance of choosing the best possible personnel to lead technological development, empowering them to take initiative in that process, and giving them broadly defined problems in a setting where they feel they have an equal stake in the solution, rather than insisting on a prescribed chain of command. And with apologies to my colleagues who have engaged so deeply with David Weber's Honorverse, this is the model to study for an out-of-the-box approach to technological development. First, let's set the scene. To solve the problem of identifying law enforcement officers to their alien counterparts, humanity did what it often does best in science fiction. It tried valiantly, failed with lethal results, and then finally just asked an elder race for help. That elder race, the Aresians, responded with the gift of the lens, a pseudo-living entity that looks like the offspring of a fighter pilot's watch and a disco ball. Okay, it's described as a lenticular polychrome of writhing, almost fluid radiance. The lens, among other tricks, gives its wearer telepathic abilities. In order to wear the lens, candidates must undergo a 5-year training and selection process that, on a reasonably populated planet, starts with 1 million cadets and graduates roughly 100 as lensmen, with the rest either washing out or getting diverted into other branches of the Galactic Patrol. The hero of the series, Kimball Kinnison, is the most qualified graduate of this process in history, helped, as one is, by millennia of Aresian-directed selective breeding. Now, the Galactic Patrol is a galaxy-wide organization that also serves as a quasi-government. And upon Kinnison's graduation, it finds itself locked in an escalating struggle with a similarly sized organization known as Bosco. After accomplishing a series of Herculean tasks as commander of a Q ship sent on an intelligence gathering mission, Kinnison is given his release. Now, to many of you, I'm sure that conjures up this image, but not so for a lensman. Kinnison is given the freedom to do whatever he wants, and the ability to requisition whatever resources he needs to accomplish his goals. No questions asked. He's also given a new uniform of gray leather. He's now known as an unattached, or gray, lensman. This is not a unique status within the patrol, but it's certainly not common either. As one might expect when a junior officer is given this sort of wide-ranging responsibility, Kinnison promptly uses his newfound freedom to go and get himself shot up. Fortunately for all involved, he doesn't risk anyone else's life, and he gets better. At this point, Kinnison realizes that the patrol's armor has a shocking problem. It's not heavy enough for one spacesuit to take on an entire enemy base and win. He sets out to rectify this glaring oversight. Tasking a unit of engineers at the patrol's headquarters, he designs and has built over 2 days a new suit of armor that takes advantage of his own unique psychic abilities. He then uses said armor to assault an enemy base. Kinnison, having used this specially developed suit to destroy a considerable portion of Bosco's Milky Way-based command and control, realizes that a radically new weapon will be needed to reduce the enemy's final stronghold in our galaxy. In fact, not only will a new weapon be needed, but a new mathematics will be needed to create the weapon. Accordingly, Kinnison does what anyone in government would do when realizing there's absolutely no other plausible way out of the hole that they've made for themselves. He organizes an academic conference. Kinnison calls together the top mathematicians and physicists in the galaxy, and with time and an unlimited budget, he bludgeons them into creating the theoretical framework needed to create a spherical region of space that destroys all matter, well, all normal matter, which it encounters. This is dubbed the negasphere. The negasphere is, in the hands of the patrol's engineers, a workable weapon, and it's used to annihilate Bosco's final holdout in the Milky Way. Kinnison returns triumphantly to Earth, ready to move on with life and career, only to be told by an Aresian that the fight isn't over yet. This is when Kinnison pulls off his biggest innovative coup of the series. Armed with nothing more than a prominent mathematician and his personal super dreadnought, he strikes out across the galaxy to visit the best academics from the aforementioned conference at their home universities. He gathers them and sets them on a highest priority task, turning the full output of the sun into a massive weapon, a sunbeam. Bosco, you see, had only lost its headquarters, not the will to fight. The Bosconian fleet arrives on Earth's doorstep in force, complete with mobile planetary fortresses. The new sunbeam, cobbled together in haste by the patrol's engineers, works brilliantly, and the hostile forces are wiped out in the universe's worst hot yoga class. Once again, Kinnison's freedom to initiate research projects as he sees fit has saved the day. So what Kinnison has done is to operate as a catalyst for rapidly and radically innovative research. He sees a problem, and money and human capital flow towards it. Oversight in this case is provided preemptively, with the assumption being that if Kinnison is working the problem, it needs to be done. Fortunately, the Galactic Patrol has the resources to back this up. A million or so worlds contributing just a small portion of their gross planetary product every year adds up pretty fast. The problems are presented to Kinnison's research teams are deceptively simple. Build a better armor, create a new offensive weapon, defend the solar system from a massive attack. Kinnison refines his R&D process over time and according to the complexity of the problem. The armor suit goes through semi-regular channels. The Negasphere is a collaboration with academia. The Sunbeam is the rapid result of a fully realized partnership with hand-picked scientific experts. Now, if this sounds like a paradigm that would get results, albeit expensive ones, that's because it has worked in real life. So let's take a moment and shift back to the real world. April 1942, Silver Spring, Maryland. Rear Admiral George Husey of the Bureau of Ordnance is appraised of a potential solution to one of the trickiest problems then facing American forces. It was phrased as a deceptively simple question. Why can't someone come up with an anti-aircraft fuse that knows when to go off? The solution was relatively simple in theory. Design a radio transmitter sturdy enough to survive being fired from the barrel of an artillery piece. In practice, this is a major challenge. Imagine trying to make sure a glass vacuum tube survives an artillery launch. The issue was solved by a group of researchers working the problem in a section of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD. This section, known as Section T, was under the direction of Merle Tuve. Tuve was a civilian scientist who, until he gained security clearance, had never thought deeply about weapons. Throughout development of the proximity fuse, Tuve's leadership and the ability of civilian experts to retain control of their own organizational structures were key. And part of that was the mindset he brought. As you can see from these quotes, he's all about getting there first. After the war, alumni of OSRD began working at Naval Ordnance Test Station China Lake. There, with Navy approval, they intentionally adapted the development approach OSRD had pioneered with the proximity fuse and other projects. Traditional military supervision was nowhere to be found. Uniformed personnel served as advisors on questions of systems operations and served to tie the facility into the Navy bureaucracy in the loosest sense possible. This trend was supported by Admiral Husey, now head of the Ordnance Bureau, and his successor, M.F. Schofield. One researcher at China Lake, William McLean, saw the issues of air-to-air combat in the jet age as requiring a new approach, one that discarded previous concepts put forward by DoD. Instead, McLean and his team, on their own initiative, sought to provide the simplest possible solution to the problem, operating outside the realm of standard acquisitions procedure. They succeeded spectacularly, developing the AIM-9 Sidewinder missile, variants of which remain in use on Navy aircraft. In the words of historian Ron Westrom, China Lake did not see itself merely as carrying out orders or evaluating systems. Rather, it was a thinking node in the socio-technical system that was the US Navy. It took pride in its ability to ask fundamental questions and come up with novel solutions. McLean and his team believed they had a license to think. As their successes multiplied, this license to think enlarged. So in short, China Lake, like Section T before it, like much of the OSRD, and like Kinnison's R&D teams, operated as a skunkworks, a streamlined research shop that could disregard institutional policy to solve problems. The process was so effective that the Sidewinder beat out traditionally acquired missiles produced by other labs as part of official programs during the same period. Eventually, though, the Navy exerted greater administrative control over China Lake, and the result was that the empowerment of researchers faded, to be replaced by standard bureaucracy. As this occurred, the military-civilian partnership originally endorsed by the Navy collapsed, and a rigid hierarchy replaced it. The result was a gradual decline as commercial carpeting replaced laboratory equipment, and cubicles filled in for workbenches. The author of the Lensman series, Doc Smith, earned his nickname. He was a chemical engineer specializing in food service, and he may have served as an explosives manufacturing expert during World War II. Verifying that, for those of you who have students, might be a good senior thesis project. His experience with research and development was not inconsiderable. His work distills several lessons about the nature of skunkworks programs. As America and the Navy move into a new era of great power competition, Smith's work deserves careful study, as it distills excellent lessons about the sacrifices that must be made to develop new technologies under the pressures of time and existential conflict. Equally deserving of study are those whose real-life exploits make Kimball Kinnison's look tame by comparison. Both teach us the same thing about successful military R&D. Pick the best qualified people for each job as it comes up, shift material resources around as needed, don't worry about who's in charge, and don't count the cost when lives are on the line. Thanks for listening. If there are any questions, I'll take them in the chat. And Giga Maggies, over to you, Claude.
Thanks again. And Jerry, are you back and have you set up shop again somewhere that doesn't have lightning strikes?
Yeah, Claude, I'm here, and I'm going to go ahead and do this share screen thing and get started. There we go. And, all right, is everyone seeing this now? Excellent. Okay, my presentation this evening is about the Honorverse, Honor Harrington universe, and looking at it from the perspective of revolutions in military affairs and the Weapons Development Board, which is a key portion in the background of the Honorverse as key technologies are developed throughout the series of books written by David Weber. So the Weapons Development Board was created in 1184 post-diaspora under the reign of Queen Elizabeth Winton's father. Actually, it was instigated under him. It actually came into being after Queen Elizabeth took over after King Roger's untimely passing. But it had been developed as part of his House of Steel effort to rebuild the Royal Manicoran Navy. He talked about wanting to build a house of steel in order to defend the kingdom. And the Weapons Development Board essentially was a cover. It was a bureaucratic cover for a series of very large black programs. Think of it with Skunk Works with a bit more oomph. It was initially led by nominally a captain, but actually secretly a Vice Admiral, Jonas Adcock, who had been the late king's best friend and who had a strong technical and administrative background. He not only knew how to come up with new ideas, but he also knew how to drive them through. Consider Kelly Johnson of Skunk Works as if he had been Eisenhower's brother-in-law, that type of closeness between the crown and the development of these new technologies. The Weapons Development Board continued after its initial deep cover origin to serve as a focal point for technological development for new capabilities within the Royal Manicoran Navy, ushering many of them into development, but also into full-scale production. So the board wasn't just a place where new ideas came. In some cases, the board actually oversaw those weapon systems going into full development, sort of not being totally dependent on industry, but actually overseeing that as well. So one of the key personalities that's associated with the board early in the books and even later is Admiral Sonia Hemphill, or Horrible Hemphill, as some are describe her. She was once described by her reporting senior as tactless, brilliant, opinionated, tactless, irritating, energetic, tactless, bouncy, confident, tactless, overenthusiastic, overly focused, and did I mention tactless? Hemphill was a source of a number of great ideas, but she was also a source of even more bad ideas. But the fact was his leadership was smart enough to recognize that if they got one good idea for every 10 that she presented, then they were coming out ahead. She first gained notice during the reign of Roger III as a relatively junior engineering duty officer, but her contributions in what was called Project Graham, which was a black project under Operation Shell Game, led to breakthroughs in areas of missile pods, multi-drive missiles, electronic countermeasures, as well as laser hits. These weapons that were developed as part of Project Graham became the bedrock for the Royal Manicoran Navies gaining a technological dominance over the People's Republic very early in the books, of something that slowly eroded over time as most technological leads happen. But she came fully into her own during the time, the administration of Edward Janicek. When he was First Lord of the Admiralty, she was his cousin. and then she became full appointed chairman of the Weapons Development Board at that time. So the board, one of the things that they came up with was the grav lance, which is an interesting idea whereby a key technology or way of sort of warping the defensive sidewall of an enemy ship. The grav lance was one of her prime ideas, and she pushed it through. It was initially successful in its initial test on board the HMS Fearless, which was Honor Harrington's second command. But once everyone figured out that the ship had to negotiate in close, everyone was able to then sort of flood the field and take out that ship early before it was able to get close enough to them. And then the grav lance became a disaster after its initial success. But other things that came out of that early board, Hemphill's time, were the recon drones, which gave extended sensor range for all the starships in the wall of battle, as well as electronic countermeasure emitters that sort of went along with those drones. And then also a huge breakthrough in faster than light communication that gave essentially the Royal Manicoran Navy an ability to communicate instantaneously vast amounts of data and communications over vast distances that none of their enemy had, and hence creating real-time picture of the wartime environment. This was a big breakthrough that was led by Hemphill. We shift now to what I'm going to call the Harrington Board. In 1908 through 1910, post-diaspora, Harrington had been assigned to command the Wayfarer, an armed merchant cruiser modified to operate as a Q ship. Think of it as a large super tanker that was carrying missiles as well as attack aircraft, but was sent out to essentially succor in people who were attacking merchant shipping. But during that time, this ship was large enough to carry assortments of light attack aircraft or light attack craft, LACs, as well as missiles carried in pods that could be rolled out of the cargo ship's hold. As such, Harrington's command of the Wayfarer allowed her to develop initial concepts of operations for eventually what both became LAC carriers as well as pod carrying missile dreadnoughts. The missiles that we were talking about here, that essentially the Weapons Development Board began to look at different sizes of missiles that could be fitted into various different sizes of ships, whether they're cruisers, battle cruisers, dreadnoughts, or super dreadnoughts. But essentially the missiles at that point in time were sort of modified to the size of the ship because larger ships could carry larger missiles. But the multi-drive missile was a major breakthrough of the Harrington Board. And that multi-drive allowed them to launch, travel outward under a set energy coast, and then reignite under their impeller drives to go faster and have maneuverability at greater range, hence the idea of gaining range over their enemy. Once they had these missiles, whether they were Ghost Riders or Apollo missiles, the next idea was to pack them into pods. Originally, the missiles would be carried in rows of tubes on the sides of the ships. But once the pod came in and that could be rolled out the back or through a cargo bay, then suddenly you had the ability to dramatically increase the number of missiles that could be carried, and thus creating an increase in your salvo size. Harrington's Wayfarer crews, essentially they would just open the cargo doors or the hatches or blow the hatches off and then roll these pods out. But as part of this board development, they looked at developing these pods in such a way that they could either be rolled and then ignited a distance away from the ships, or perhaps even towed by tractor beams behind the larger ships. And again, all of this was with the idea of creating larger density of fire, increased salvos in order to overwhelm the enemy's defenses. Once you had pods, of course, then you want to start modifying your ships, the hammerheads, the aft sections of the larger ships within the Royal Manicoran Navy, in order so that the pods could come out, that there would be an opening there for them to be able to be exited. Once the Navy recognized that it needed to change the design of the hammerhead, that gave them a chance to essentially change the design of their ships altogether. And this led to the large Royal Manicoran Navy ship, originally called the Honor Harrington because it was thought at the time that she was dead, but when she came back, they renamed it But these ships essentially were super dreadnoughts, pod carrying, and once they had these pods on board, each one of these ships could carry up to nearly 500 missiles internally and then roll them out during battle. So they not only retained the side missiles that they could launch from the sides of the ships, but then they could also discharge the missiles from the back. The key point about this was this led to a breakthrough so you had a missile that leads to pods, that leads to redesigning your fleet, and then that leads to a total new concept of operations for the way the fleet was going to operate, a new strategy, as it were, for the way the Navy would operate. Hence, you see key technologies should alter the way that the fleet considers how it will operate in the strategic environment. One of the other things that came out of the Harrington board because of her experience with the Wayfarer was the development of advanced light attack craft, or LACs. These new ships were not like the previous ones. They had much larger impeller drives as well as gravity compensators, but they also came with increased weapons capability that through an increase in or upgrade in their beta nodes that allowed them to essentially maneuver at range and then obliquely attack their enemies, so they weren't going essentially from the side, but taking them from various different angles in order to confuse the enemy and overwhelming them. Of course, once you create a new attack craft, you have to carry it on something, and so this led to the development of the LAC carrier. And again, Harrington's experience as the CO of the Wayfarer allowed her to visualize what this attack carrier should be. So of course, we see a lot of parallels with the development of carriers and then ultimately super carriers within our own last century. But this was the Minotaur class that was designed to deploy multiple squadrons of LACs from outside missile range, and then they could go in and make their attacks and then get out of the area, hopefully without coming under the threat of the conventionally armed offender. That is, the Minotaur carrier itself was meant to launch its light attack craft from beyond range and then gather them back up, the survivors at least, because these were small enough that they were considered to be expendable, and then regather them to be able to fight again another day with what remained. So the point here is these represented a great demonstration in fiction of a revolution in military affairs. Hemphill herself represents a leader who was interested in advancing science and technology in the fleet, and she pursued these new ideas with the expectation that many would fail, but some would succeed. And she became a constant advocate for these things. Essentially, a person who recognizes that if you as a fleet are standing still, you're probably going backwards in relationship to your enemy. Harrington came with new ideas that emerged out of her operational experience and that she pushed forward as she gained in rank. The thing to keep in mind are the lessons that I take away from this is, one is understand that the basis of war is to generate mass that can maneuver from range farther than your enemy can shoot. I mean, that's the bottom line of modern warfare. The other things from an administrative or bureaucratic standpoint is, hey, consider all new ideas, even some that appear bad. The breakthroughs in warfare emerge from unlikely places. And also set aside a portion of your fleet's budget and its development energy as a culture to consider new ideas and then experiment heavily with them. Do not become complacent with your technology lead. Once you're out there and you're at the head of the pack, don't sit still, keep pressing. Draw hard on the lessons from combat. It's hard won, lessons learned in blood. Take those lessons and plow them back into your investment strategy. And when you've been away from combat a long time, worry about the validity of your assumptions. If you haven't fought a major war in 30 or even 70 years, you might want to sit back and consider what the underlying assumptions are and whether they're still valid. And then talk to your state's political leadership to garner support. Be ready to talk with the people to explain the importance of your work as well if you really do want to move ahead. And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jerry. And we're going to shift over to a message from Congressman Mike Gallagher.
Good evening and welcome to NavyCon 2020. Thank you to Claude for putting together such a great lineup of speakers outside of Jerry Hendricks, Mark Vandroff, David Larder. I'm not sure how they snuck in and made the cut, but thank you for allowing me to take part in this distinguished event, which once again has to be the preeminent virtual meeting of nerds anywhere in the universe outside of World of Warcraft. Somehow, in fact, this event manages to get nerdier every single year. When Claude invited me to speak in 2017, I think the topics included acquisition best practices in Star Wars, why Space Force rightfully belongs to the Navy. That's still true, by the way. And of course, my nuanced and authoritative discussion of Starship Troopers that almost managed not to get me reelected in my first term. But looking at the agenda today, I think we've got talks on hydrodynamics, engineering, Babylon 5, and not one, but two deep dives into the Battle of Endor, because one was not enough. And so I say this with no particular pleasure, but you've all really managed to out-nerd yourselves this time around. The good news, I guess, is that it's actually a great time to be a nerd. Everyone is shut in. Our social life takes place online, and everyone has lots of time to read science fiction and draw lessons for modern strategy. I just finished John Scalzi's Old Man's War series, and as my wife was making fun of me, I was reflecting on why. I mean, why am I always drawn back to science fiction? Why does it have this hold on me? Shouldn't I be reading Foucault or some CSBA study on the range of the carrier air wing? But in the first instance, I enjoy it, as I imagine you all do. Science fiction is fun. And whenever I get immersed in a new science fiction world, I'm always reminded of what is perhaps my favorite quote of all time from Herman Melville, when he says, "I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts." And it's that feeling of being able to sail a forbidden sea and land on a barbarous coast that I always have when I'm reading science fiction. But it's more than that enjoyment. It's, I believe, an important exercise. It's been a tough few months, few years for the Navy that we love. And now more than ever, I think we need creative ideas, and we need to empower younger officers with creative ideas. We have to better align with some of the revolutionary changes that are taking place in the Marine Corps today and come out on the other side of this process as a truly integrated naval force. And I think science fiction can help us do that. And judging by the presenters and the audience that are here today, I have no doubt that our Navy will be up to the challenge. So say we all.
So say we all. And David Larder, you are up.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and as I just work out some technical details here. Can you see my screen, Claude?
It's up.
Okay, great. All right, so in 2002, I was a goofy, awkward 18-year-old operations specialist seaman apprentice and new check-in on board USS Normandy. As many of you are aware, that is a Ticonderoga-class cruiser purpose-built to operate the U.S. Navy's world-class Aegis combat system. Now, Aegis is primarily an air defense system designed to protect aircraft carriers and, of course, the ship itself from incoming missiles and aircraft, but it synthesizes and displays for operators inputs from all the ship's sensors inside the Combat Information Center. And my job was to be the surface radar controller. That was my first job anyway. Now, when you grow up reading Tom Clancy and Stephen Kuntz novels, you imagine the military as being pretty high tech, pretty cutting edge. So when you walk into CIC on board USS Normandy in 2002, and you're confronted with what I was confronted with, you may be a little bit confused. The computers ran on computers that I hadn't seen since the 80s, and keep in mind, I was 4 and 5. The displays looked like my brother's Ataris, and when I found out that I had to manually track surface contacts, I was somewhat appalled. Now, the new installs of Aegis, and let's go to the next slide here. I say next slide like somebody else is doing this, but it's just me. The new installs of Aegis Baseline, this is the old install here. You can see the old computers here. And the new installs that you can see right here, this is actually USS Normandy. I think that's the current commanding officer, Chris Stone. there at his display. You can see the flat screens, color displays. A kid that grew up in the video game generation could look at that and say, oh, that's high tech. It's actually a really cool system now. But, you know, even my dinky little system, I learned to love it, right? This clunky bit of 70s technology, as I learned it, I realized it's a really elegant system. And on the air warfare side, that's where the real magic happened, right? So for the uninitiated, Aegis has what's known as auto special mode. And for the vast majority of circumstances, you want full control of your sensors and your missile systems. You know, you don't want, you know, your computer controlling the weapons. But let's say you get in an all-out missile fight, right? Missiles coming in from all sides. There are going to be too many inputs for the human brain and the human body to take the necessary action. So at that point, this is an oversimplification, auto special can be engaged. And what happens essentially is that everything that's identified through its flight profile as being a hostile track or a hostile aircraft from sensor inputs gets shot down. Now, here's where I want to kind of draw you know, your attention to, and we're getting to Alien, I promise. The things we're talking about today, right? The ethical decisions we're wrestling with. You know, how much do we want to trust computers with life and death decisions? We're not talking about a revolution. This is an evolution from where we are today. Having Aegis decide to kill something and having a loitering munition decide that for us, you know, goes out there, sees something, it decides it's threatening and kill it. You know, yes, that's a big step, but it's not a huge step, and that technology exists today. Now, I want to circle back to thinking about Aegis as a computer with a certain amount of autonomy when it's engaged, right? So think about it in the context of Siri or Alexa. Computers that we talk to and respond to our orders. Now, instead of the tactical action officer, and that's this guy right here, saying, you know, hey, SWIC, it's the surface warfare commander, kill track 50675 with guns, you might say, hey, Aegis, kill track 50675 with guns, and the ship did it automatically. Now let's take it just a different direction here. Let's say we integrated Aegis into more things, right? Let's say TAC wants to wake up the oncoming watch section, for example. Does it seem like much of a technological heavy lift to say, Aegis, wake up the oncoming watch sections, and little alarms go off in their racks? You can see a rack here, you know, and, you know, they get up and they wake up. Now, what if Aegis was just programmed to do that, right? What if Aegis just said, hey, at 23:15, the midwatch has to get up, hit the showers, hit midrats, and get on watch, right? Now, what if instead of Aegis, what if we called the computer Mother? Haha, this is where I'm getting to it. Ridley Scott's 1979 movie Alien shows two potential pitfalls of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. One, these systems can breed dependence and an over-reliance on a system that can either be gamed or reprogrammed by a malign actor. And two, and perhaps more dangerously, we risk the introduction of a system with an agenda not fully understood by its operators. All right, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just briefly outline the premise of the movie. The Nostromo, the ship we see here, is a commercial towing vehicle hauling lots of deep space mineral ore, and it has a crew of 7, and it is on its return journey to Earth. The Nostromo is a vessel that is operated and owned by the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. And I want to stop right here and say, I know there's some people with advanced engineering degrees on the line. I just want to encourage you that before you take a job at Weyland-Yutani, please read the reviews on Glassdoor. They are not good. So because of the vast distances required for deep space travel, the human crew is put into what's called hypersleep, right? This is the Nostromo's patch, by the way. It's dope. Which basically means hypersleep is you go in a little pod, you're in your underwear, and you get essentially frozen. Your cells go into stasis for a long period of time. Now that is revolutionary technology. I don't want to downplay that. But you know, that's part of the getting to deep space with a human crew. Now the crew is under a mandate that they don't fully understand, that gets explained later, that they have to respond to any distress signals. Now, when it comes into contact with a signal coming from a ship on a moon, a downed ship, the ship's autonomous computer brain, its AI brain, known as Mother, wakes the crew to respond. Now, Ripley, she's the star of this movie, but I don't want to focus too much on her, sadly. I want to really focus on the actions of Dallas. Dallas is the ship's CO. Because it's kind of Dallas's decisions that lead to the unfortunate business with the xenomorph. So when the crew is woken up by Mother, Dallas informs them that they are not in fact approaching Earth. They've been woken up early and they're still a good long ways away. And here's a piece of dialogue I want to highlight for you. I'm not going to read it all for you, but essentially what happens here is the crew is objecting to having to go on this BS side mission. Dallas is like, Mother says so, we're doing it. And this is Ash right here. He comes up a little later, but Ash is all about doing it because we find out later he has some mixed motivations, and we're going to get into that. Well, very clear motivations. But anyway, you see in this dialogue that Dallas doesn't question Mother's actions. He does, nor does he wait to gather full intel on the nature of the signal. A little later on, Ripley interprets the signal or manages to break enough of it and finds that the signal was actually a warning to stay away. It wasn't a come help us signal. So the crew, the search party goes out into danger unknowingly, and they find a derelict alien spaceship. They go on board. Kane, the executive officer, finds some fun eggs. He looks at them. He's like, oh, what's this? And they were not cool. Things did not go well. So a face sucker jumps out and catches onto Kane's face, and he has to come back to the ship. Now, here's another place where we find out that Dallas is not the world's greatest commanding officer. He wants Ripley to open the spaceship door so they can bring Kane on board. Now, that breaks quarantine protocols that are very sensible that Ripley is following. Don't bring foreign organisms on board. But Ash, our science officer friend, overrides Ripley, goes behind her back, and opens the door, even though she is the senior officer on board. Ripley then challenges Ash a little later in the movie. He pretends he was letting Kane in for humanitarian reasons. Now, I want to move forward just a little bit in the film to get to the business at hand here. And there's another key moment after the sucker detaches from Kane's face and before the alien pops out of Kane's chest at the dinner table, that we see the kind of CO Dallas is. Dallas lets Ash keep the dead face sucker over Ripley's strenuous injection. And it cannot be stressed enough, Ripley had every reason to believe that it was not a good idea to keep this thing on board. It should have been discarded. Acid eating through the deck and what have you. But Dallas again defers to Ash. He says, you're the science officer, it's your decision. And when Ripley challenges him again, we get this great moment that we see here. How could you have led that decision to him? I just run the ship. Anything that has to do with the science division, Ash has the final word. This is a theme with Dallas, right? He can't, he just is constantly listening to Mother, listening to orders from the company. He's not using his head. He's not using his command authority. And he doesn't feel like he has authority in various places, which is a real problem. Essentially, I think what I like to see here, what I like to highlight here is the same way everything else happens, orders from the company. So I think that's the really important thing to bring out. Now, we want to fast forward to the end. Alien pops out of Kane's chest, goes on a killing spree, ultimately kills the poor and feckless Dallas and the rest of the crew. Critically, we find out that Ash, who is insisted on letting the life form on the ship in the first place, was in fact an android, artificially intelligent, autonomous system, programmed by Weyland-Yutani and we find out that he was collaborating with Mother to, at all costs, return any alien life form to the good people at the Weyland-Yutani Bioweapons Division. The crew was, of course, expendable in this pursuit. Ripley takes command of the ship after Dallas gets took, ends up being the lone survivor along with Jonesy the cat, and ultimately manages to get Mother to trigger Nostromo's self-destruct mechanism. Now, there's a couple things I want to draw out in this parable of autonomy and artificial intelligence that I think are applicable to the Navy as we go forward with higher levels of autonomy in our systems. As the Navy moves towards ever greater levels of autonomy, there's a significant risk that humans become too dependent on autonomous systems, deferring, like Dallas, to Mother rather than using his head for more than a hat rack. Of course, Mother has our best interests at heart, correct? Well, there are regular stories about people who follow their GPS into rivers or lakes because of programming errors. Now, I want to think of this in the context of warfare, and here's my 2 points here. In the context of warfare, there's a significant risk that either through cyber warfare, espionage, or even an honest mistake on the part of the programmers, future autonomous systems could have an agenda that the crew won't know about, and the consequences could be a disaster. Number 2, crews must be fully familiar with the systems on board their ships and have an exquisite understanding of how their systems will behave in any circumstance. These systems will, like Ash, be part of the crew, and that's exactly how the Navy needs to think about it. The tools of the past, the old Aegis system that I was working on, were pretty incredible for their day, but they're getting more advanced, and it will become even more important for sailors to understand their systems. No surprises. Ash was on a mission that nobody knew about. On a ship in combat, you need the crew in complete alignment as to what the mission is. That's going to be key to being successful in integrating greater levels of autonomy. Operators have to know what their systems are going to do. All right, as we close, it's important to note that the voyage of the Nostromo was a total mission failure for Weyland-Yutani. It goes back to misalignment of its crew, and that includes Mother and Ash, right? They didn't deliver their payload of mineral ore to Earth, and the secret mission the crew didn't even know they'd signed up for was a failure as well. Ripley ultimately kills the xenomorph in the escape pod. And it's my worry that as we move down this path without total alignment between the crew and its autonomous little helpers, the Navy could be setting itself up for accidentally allowing giant murderous aliens on board its vessels that kill the whole crew. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I'll answer any questions that you have in chat.
Thanks, Dave. All right, Mark Van Droff, are you ready?
I am. So in honor of David, I have poured myself a scotch. In honor of Jennifer, it's in my Carderock cup, my Carderock lowball there. Let me see if I can get this computer to work. All right, I am sharing my screen. And we are starting play. Claude, can you hear me?
Good to go, Mark.
Okay. So the standard disclaimer, the views I am about to express are my own personal views, and I'm speaking in a personal capacity. They do not reflect the views of the National Security Council and or the Trump administration. So for those of you who were involved or have seen the YouTube video of NavyCon1, NavyCon the original, most kind people refer to my talk that day as the funny talk. The unkind people call it the ridiculous talk. I tried to do a funny talk tonight because Lord knows we could all use some levity, but this is going to be more therapy than it is commentary. This is a window on the soul of Mark Van Droff tonight as told through science fiction. I'm also, in the spirit of BJ Armstrong and his kickoff tonight, going to be honoring the anniversary of the Battle of Midway. So we're here tonight to talk about science fiction. And when most people hear the word science fiction, these are the kinds of characters that they think of. You see there the iconic Captain Kirk, or the evil Darth Vader, or the good Darth Vader, depending upon your perspective. The brave Rey, the Klingons, the great Honor Harrington. We tend to think about the heroes and the villains when it comes to science fiction, the main actors and actresses in the story being told. But this is what I think of when I hear science fiction. I think of the characters that put the heroes in position to do their heroics. And some of these might be familiar to you and some of them might not. Up in my upper left-hand corner of the screen, Zephyr Cochrane, who in Star Trek lore invents the warp drive. Or Geordi LaForge, the engineer in Star Trek The Next Generation, who keeps the Enterprise running in fit form. And then Chewbacca. Now, everyone thinks of Chewie as big and lovable and a fierce fighter, but notice on the Millennium Falcon, he's always the one while Han Solo is flying around trying to avoid the Empire or go on the next crazy mission that Han Solo is taking him on. Chewie's the one that when the blasters start flying is trying to keep the Millennium Falcon together. In the bottom right there, my favorite, Orson Krennic, everybody's favorite program manager in Rogue One, the man who brought it all together in order to get the Death Star built. And there in the upper right, a little known character, but my favorite character from the Honorverse, Paul Tankersley, Honor Harrington's first love. And I think that it's no accident that David Weber made Honor Harrington's first love a Manticoran engineering duty officer who fixes her broken ship, the Nike, in record time. And we'll see how the importance of that a little later in my talk. So I think science fiction starts with history. And since this is the anniversary of Midway, let's use Midway as an example. I've got some pictures here, and I'm going to talk about some of the key points of Midway. Midway was often considered, it's considered by many, the turning point of World War II in the Pacific. But what made the American victory in Midway possible? And I would argue that before we think about the leadership of Spruance or the strategy of Halsey or the bravery of McCampbell, we think about the ability to innovate, to operate, to repair, and to manage. There in the upper left-hand corner, you see Yorktown. She had been damaged at Coral Sea. Nobody thought she was going to be ready to go for months. But the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, through management, through innovation, and the ability to be creative, repaired that ship enough that she could deploy and be that third U.S. carrier at the Battle of Midway. Down in the bottom right, what are you looking at there? Well, you're looking at the superstructure of the Lexington shortly before she was sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. But what you're looking at there is all the installations of what at the time was a radical new technology called radar. Now, by the start of World War II, all the navies, modern navies of the world had radar. Japan, Germany also had radar, as well as the US and the UK. But the US and the UK were far ahead in radar development. And radar would prove decisive, if not so much in the maritime battle, certainly in the operations off Midway. Because of for its day, advanced land-based radar at Midway, there was enough warning of impending Japanese raids to get an adequate air defense of Midway. And the first Japanese bombing raid of the islands was ineffective, and Japan had to reassess whether or not it was going to be able to launch an amphibious operation. And the time it took them to do that was one of the critical factors in allowing Spruance's fleet to get into position to attack. Also, the innovation in cryptological intelligence famously allowed the US to have sufficient insight into Japanese maneuver plans through breaking their code as to give them a tactical advantage during Midway. And then finally, in a very underappreciated part of the battle, Yorktown did eventually succumb and sink due to her damage during at the end of the Battle of Midway. But the damage control efforts on Yorktown were so significant that it took multiple strikes by the Japanese in order to sink that. And she retained a fair amount of combat capability even while damaged. And the Japanese fleet having to focus its attacks on the Yorktown allowed the other carriers in the engagement to re-engage and finish off the Japanese strike fleet. So what did we hear from Midway? We had an example of a fleet that was advantaged, and we look back at the Battle of Midway as made into movies many, many times. And it's Halsey, and it's Spruance, and it's the aviators, but they were set up by people who could manage, people who could innovate, people who could repair, and people who could operate. So now I take you to the Battle of Hancock Station, one of the great battles or I should say, the First Battle of Hancock Station, in David Weber's A Short Victorious War. And what do we have? Well, similar to Yorktown, we have the HMS Nike Honor ship and the flagship of Bat Crew Ron 5, Mark Sarno's battlecruiser squadron. Nike, newest and most advanced ship in the squadron, shows up broken. A terrible reactor casualty has placed it out of commission. Paul Tankersley and the ship repair crew at Hancock Station in record time replaces the reactor with a new one and gets Nike ready to go in time to meet the Havenite threat. Once the battle is joined, a new technology, not radar, but missile pods, again, put in place as my colleague Jerry Hendricks talked about by the War Development Board, by officers who could innovate and manage, gave the Manticorans enough of an edge to hold off a numerically superior Havanite force. And that holding off of the numerically superior Havanite forces was what turned the tide at the Battle of Hancock Station, much like the carriers were able to turn the tide at the Battle of Midway. So what was my takeaway here as we talk about engineering in great power competition? Engineers innovate, they operate, they repair, and they maintain. And the lessons from both history and science fiction show that you have to have this in an era of great power competition, that all the great tactics and strategy and the heroic actions of the warfighters, you don't even get up to that starting line if your engineering community can't get you there with the kit that you need. And just like human nature, the discipline of engineering to provide that capability is eternal, and it contains certain fundamental truths, whether you're doing it 70 years ago in the World War II era, whether you're thinking about it 2,000 years in the future in the world of science fiction, or whether it's something that's being done to compete today. And I end with my tribute to then Citizen Commander, later Vice Admiral Shannon Forker, another one of my absolute favorite characters from the Honorverse, as she says, oops, and launches one of the great cyber attacks of science fiction in history. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Mark. And with that, I'm going to share the screen here and get David Weber up here to introduce our next two guests or presenters.
I'm David Weber, and they had me at the first NavyCon. They actually let me come back to present this time, despite what happened at the first NavyCon. I think that science fiction and naval analysis, naval history, they're kind of joined at the hip in a lot of ways. Science fiction writers automatically reach for the naval model when we get into interstellar or interplanetary or just plain deep space combat, because it is, I think, undoubtedly the best model available. And the things that make it the best model available for science fiction also mean that science fiction can actually offer analytical insights in an artificially created world. The two guys that I have been asked to introduce have seen both sides of that. Chris Weave, I have known for several years, and he is, in fact, the founder and the current president of BU9, which is an organization of my fans and readers who came together to sort of be a think tank for me. And they have contributed hugely to the development of what we call the Honorverse, the Honor Harrington universe going forward. Now, in addition to the important stuff that he's done for me, Chris is also, he's a former war game designer and exercise analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses. He's a former professor of wargaming at the Naval War College, and he's a former naval analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I understand that he has recently gone back into government employ, returning to the dark and nefarious things that he has done in the past. Now, the other fellow that I'm introducing is Phil Pornell. He is a retired commander. He was retired after 26 years in the Navy as a surface warfare officer, as an operations analyst and planner. And he served on cruisers, he served on destroyers and amphibious ships and experimental high-speed vessel. He served on the Navy staff doing campaign analysis and at the Office of the Secretary of Defense Cost Assessment, Program Evaluation, and at the Office of Net Assessment. He was the Senior Director for Wargaming and Analysis at the Long-Term Strategy Group after retiring, and he is now Senior Operations Analyst and Game Designer at Group W. So both of these guys have extensive real-world experience in the kind of things that NavyCon is looking at. Both of them have deep ties to science fiction, and working with both of them, I can tell you that they have both made connections between their real-world knowledge base and the world of science fiction. So I think that you should probably sit back and listen to what they have to say at sort of the interface where reality meets speculative fiction, because I think it's going to be very much worth hearing. So enjoy.
And Chris, over to you.
All right, thank you. Let me share this real quick. Okay, all right. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Claude and the U.S. Naval Academy for the opportunity to present here today. I'm honored to participate in this project. I really enjoyed the first NavyCon, and I'm really excited about being able to be part of the second one. I'd also like to thank all of my fellow presenters for the excellent work that they've done this evening. I think we've seen some really great presentations. And so thank you very much for setting a high bar for the guy who's coming in last to do or second to last to do all this. So let me start off by saying that this presentation takes a different approach than that of some of my colleagues. So most of my colleagues in this tonight look at science fiction as a way to examine the real world. So it's really about getting examples from science fiction and then applying them to the real world. Whereas I have a tendency to kind of look at the real world as a way to examine and improve science fiction. So I'm sort of doing it backwards. And which hopefully will enable science fiction to do a better job of explaining and affecting the real world. So in the end, we kind of end up in the same place, but we kind of take different paths to get there. I'm going to go through basically 4 sections this evening. The first one I'm almost done with, which is the introduction. Then I'm going to do some examples from science fiction. I'm going to take a look at the characteristics of real-world aircraft carriers a little bit. And then I'll look at how those characteristics, what we can think about how science fiction might work based upon those characteristics. So this talk is really about the intersection of my job and my hobby. But this talk is not really the opinion of anybody but me. That includes the opinion of my hosts here, the opinion of Claude, the opinion of the Naval Academy. It also is not the opinion of any past, present, or future employer. And I think that's important enough that I actually, you'll notice I put it on the slide twice. It's also not a comprehensive discussion of the idea of space-going aircraft carriers. It's really an overview, and there's exceptions to almost every rule, and the details are important, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to paint with a very broad brush this evening, especially since I only have 12 minutes to do it in. I'm not going to try to make an argument in favor of the right way to do things, because everything I've included is something of which I am a big fan, even though some of the comments I'm going to say could be interpreted as being critical of that particular implementation. The technical assumptions behind any given science fiction background are incredibly important. This is why I don't try to do things like compare different universes very often, because I think a lot of those conversations just sort of ignore all the technical details that really sort of drive the problem. So I'm going to try to keep it as big picture as I can think of, but keep in mind that that really does change based upon what specific details you're looking at in any given thing. So David Weber in particular is a master of doing stuff like that. He'll start with sort of like where he wants to end up, but he does a really good job of making sure that the technical details create the universe that he wants, as opposed to him just sort of fiating it works this way. And then you look at it and go, wait a minute, I don't understand why it works that way. My goal is really to highlight some issues from consideration. I'd like you to try to make you a better consumer of science fiction in the end. So I'm pretty broad brush. I like everything. I don't think that you should come away not liking something that you previously liked. On the other hand, disbelief should be suspended but not lynched. And I appreciate the people who go to the trouble of learning how the real world works and incorporating it in their science fiction as appropriate. So let's take a look at what I will call the bottom line up front. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier can be thought of as being a door between the sea and the sky. It allows a Navy to combine the high performance of aircraft with the endurance and capacity of ships. It's a way of having your cake and eating it too. And doing that in a traditional naval environment very far away from the land. Those performance differences between the seaborne platforms and the airborne platforms look a lot, performance differences would look a lot different in space between those different types of platforms, because you don't really have two media. You have one media, right? So you're not really manipulating that advantage between having two different environments that you're operating in. You've only got the one environment. Science fiction space-going carriers largely ignore these differences in media that I would argue define the problem of fighter-type craft, carried craft, and larger carrier-type craft. Most science fiction starts with a naval model, runs it through the science fiction converter, often without bothering to turn it on first, slaps in space with a couple of exclamation points on the end of it, and then calls it a day. As a result, a lot of it, I would argue, doesn't quite make sense if you look at it critically. Oops, sorry about that. So let's take a look at what I would argue are pure carriers, and Battlestar Galactica is a really good example of this. So what do I mean by a pure carrier? In a pure carrier, most of the offensive punch is in the embarked fighters. Now, I'll note, you sort of look at this and go, where are the strike aircraft? Where are the strikers in all of this, right? Battlestar Galactica was famous for in both of them, it's like you're pewing the other guys to death. It's like if you had World War II, but nobody was allowed to have anything other than 50 cals to attack enemy ships. You sort of wonder where's the ability to actually reach out and hurt somebody. Most of the shipboard armament in these ships was defensive in nature, although both of these facts are sometimes muddled by the medium. And by that, I don't mean the fact that they're in space, I mean the fact that they're on television. Both the Galactica seem to suddenly acquire offensive missiles when they need them, for instance. And you know, the new one did have nuclear weapons, but they seem to be a lot less effective than the nuclear weapons I used to study in terms of their capabilities. So overall, there's a lot of questions I have when I watch these shows, even though I really love both of them. So next, let's take a look at Stargate and Babylon 5, which I would describe as being hybrid carriers. So what do I mean by a hybrid carrier? So there's, as you know from looking at these are both ships that have clearly an offensive punch aside from the carried craft. There's basically a battleship carrier combination. And we see specifically, though, that they do carry large numbers of carried craft on board. So they really sort of function in both ways. You sort of wonder, though, why they bother with the fighters. What did the fighters do? There doesn't really seem to be any strikers on either of these also. And you can come up with interesting explanations as to why you might find fighters to be useful. But as a naval analyst, whenever I watch these shows, I sort of sit back and wonder, you know, if I had all the data, would I conclude that these were worth the time and effort? And it sort of makes you wonder. In the real world, you really didn't have hybrid carriers because the necessity of being an aircraft carrier and the necessity of being a battleship sort of puts you in different frames of operation. You really couldn't do both at the same time. You can't have the battle line being locked into the direction of the wind in order for it to operate. It has to operate independently. And aircraft carriers are big things full of dangerous aviation gas, etc. You want them far away from the ship's guns because they'll go up like a big explosion if they get hit, whereas battleships by definition are designed to close with the enemy. So they're really sort of operate along different lines, and just you sort of wonder why it makes sense to put them together, but in space it might make more sense to do that. I would also argue that in science fiction you see something that I call the torpedo boat carrier. One example of this is Scott Geyer's massively underappreciated Ganellan series. So what do I mean by a torpedo boat carrier? I mean that the offensive and defensive punch is from larger, long duration carried craft. Much, much bigger than fighters, much bigger than the aircraft analog. These are things that have endurance measured in days, if not weeks, and they have a pretty good offensive punch in and of themselves. In Ganellan, you have long duration sublight corvettes as the main offensive defensive weapon, and unarmed jump ships to get them from system to system. And these corvettes are big enough, they've got a crew of approximately 20, and what you're looking at on the side there is a hatch designed to carry a separate lander. So these are spacecraft that only operate outside the atmosphere, and there's a separate lander that goes down to the planet. And so that's sort of how they're set up. And by the way, Geyer is a Naval Academy graduate. He's graduated at the tail end of the Vietnam War. When I read his books, I looked at them and went, this guy is a naval aviator. I can tell he's a naval aviator because I can see his characters going through the checklist when they do stuff. And I tracked him down on the internet, yay internet, sent him a note, said, hey, by the way, are you naval aviator? I think you must have been a P3 guy or something. And he came back and said that he wasn't a P3 guy, but he had been an academy grad. He had gone off and was an officer attached to a squadron on an aircraft carrier, but he wasn't rated. And they gave him, in the post-Vietnam drawdown, they gave him the option of an early out. So he grabbed the handles and left the aircraft and went into civilian life and became a computer guy. But I was correct in that he was indeed a naval aviator, more or less, for our purposes. The second example of torpedo boat carriers I'm going to look at is something that Jerry Hendricks previously looked at, which is the Honor Harrington Sea Lax. So in the Honorverse, you've got long duration light attack craft as the main offensive defensive punch for some systems. You still have pod knots and all the rest of that, but there are very specific roles and missions in which these light attack craft are useful. And those missions change over time as the technology and doctrine evolves. That's one of the things that I really love about Weber's works, is that the stuff that works at the beginning doesn't work later on, right? Things change over time. You shouldn't confuse these LACs for fighters. They're huge. A LAC has less than the half the length of a DDG-51, but it's got twice the mass because it's so much bigger in the other dimensions. And it's very dense inside, and it's only got like a crew of 20. It's got much greater endurance than a fighter. This is not really a fighter. This is more like an escort warship that just happens to be carried by a bigger carrier type craft. You can combine some of these ideas together. For instance, C.J. Cherry in her Alliance Union universe gives us effectively hybrid torpedo boat carriers. Her carriers are a combination battleship, torpedo boat carrier, and troop assault transport. They've got significant ship-to-ship weapons. The torpedo boat, like Riders, are capable of long duration in-system ops, and they've got a pretty good punch too. They carry thousands of about 1,000 troops on board for seizing stations and prize crews and the like. Don't be fooled by the naval terminology and ranks that Cherry uses. If you really sort of look at that stuff, it's very, very sui generis. It borrows terminology from the Navy, but she didn't just run it through the science, terrestrial Navy through the science fiction converter. And if Mark Van Droff has not read Hellburner, he really should. It's about an acquisition program for those writers. It actually predates the, Down Below Station is the artwork on the left, and that's the first book in the series, but she went back to an earlier time period when they were building that fleet. Hellburner is about the acquisition program, and at one point, one of the characters has to explain to the senatorial committee that the reason why the program is all screwed up is because they gave them a really old space station to operate off of, and as a result, they're having to use development funds to do operations and maintenance stuff sort of off the record, because otherwise their station would fall apart and kill them. So I found it very interesting in that regard. Now I'm going to look at some of the characteristics of real-world characters, and at the end I'll sort of apply it back to science fiction. So here are the salient features of an aircraft carrier. You've got a flight deck, and that flight deck is large, and it includes a method of launch, and there's a couple of different ways you can do that, and a method of recovery, and there's a couple of different ways to do that, but they're all sort of oriented on the flight deck. It's also where you park airplanes in addition to launching and recovering them. You've got a hangar deck where you take them below to actually fix them if you need to fix them. And you've got a method to get between the flight deck and the hangar deck. And then on top of that, you've got a huge propulsion space, because this is a big ship. It has to be, because that flight deck needs to be away from the water. You need to get it out of the turbulent air that's near the surface of the water. And you need to move it through the ocean as fast as you can to get wind over the flight deck to aid the performance of the airplanes involved. You're dealing with some very tight margins. As a result of the fact that the flight deck, even though these ships are huge, the flight deck is really very short, and as a result, you've got very tight margins involved in all of this. So I would argue that an aircraft carrier is, by definition, a vessel that's built around these salient features. Those salient features drive the bus. Unlike, for instance, a DDG, where, you know, okay, it's important that you put a hangar on it, you got to slap a flight deck on it, et cetera, but you don't really build the ship around that. Those are important, but you don't build the ship around it. So here's a few rules of thumb with regard to aircraft carriers. And let's only talk about the big picture here. There's a lot on this slide. So there are 4 important things to take away from this slide. First of all, any increase in capability drives towards a bigger ship. The second is that VTOL will not save you from any of the rest of this, right? Because VTOL costs, if you pay a performance penalty, there's a whole bunch of reasons why it won't save you. Finally, larger carriers are more efficient than a smaller carrier. So those are the 3 big bullets that sort of define all this. And then the 4th point is, of the 8 sub-bullets I've presented here that are supporting those 3 things I just talked about, fully half of those sub-bullets are directly related to the needs of quickly moving a large stable flight deck through the water in order to facilitate the operation of aircraft. And the other bullets are generally about why to make the carrier even bigger. Not about needing a carrier in the first place, not about the design considerations of like, what do you need to do as a minimum to get a flight deck, but it's along the lines of if you got a carrier, you should make it as big as possible. So keep this in mind, especially that part about the needs of the flight deck. So let's go back to our bottom line. Real-world aircraft carriers are fundamentally a mechanism for transitioning between the 2 different media of the air and the sea, because the air and the sea have fundamentally different characteristics, and you need that doorway to move between them. Aircraft carriers are a way of using these differences to our advantage. But if you don't have 2 different media, you don't need a flight deck. You don't need the propulsion space. You don't need the method of launch, the method of recovery, et cetera. You can open a door and just push it out the back and it floats out the back. So you don't need to build a ship around that flight deck in order to get the capabilities of having a fighter. And it's also sort of curious as to what those capabilities would be. Let's take a closer look at these things. So first of all, implications for space-going fighters. It's unclear to me at best why most science fiction fighters would really make sense, at least in terms of just the way of running them through the science fiction converter with it mostly turned off. You've got a real lack of endurance. You've got a real lack of ship-killing weapons, usually as presented in science fiction, because I would argue they really didn't think it through all the way. So something that meets the definition, the sort of terrestrial definition of a fighter, just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Torpedo boat carriers may be a better model because torpedo boats actually make much more sense in this idea. Like terrestrial torpedo boats, it's the same media. In science fiction, it's in space. Terrestrial Navy, it's on the surface of the ocean. But the environment is actually much better in space, because the real reason why torpedo boats don't work very well, and this could be a lecture in and of itself, but you know, in summary, the real reason is that they're really susceptible to wave action and weather and hydrodynamics and all those other things. All those things that push towards a bigger ship with an aircraft carrier, a lot of them, the hydrodynamic reasons and stability reasons, mean that torpedo boats just aren't a good platform to operate out of. That's why torpedo boats always had their greatest successes when they were operating in sheltered waters. In addition to that, a torpedo boat has a much greater endurance than a fighter. So you've got a lot more tactical flexibility in how you're going to use these things, and you're likely to need it because, as we all know, space is really big, and that in turn implies that missions might last a while. It's not just the space-going fighters that have there are implications for. There's also the space-going carriers themselves. So maybe you don't end up with battleship hybrids, but something that looks more like a cruiser hybrid. In the real world, think about the idea of something that looks like a Tycho or an Arleigh Burke, except make it about 5,000 to 8,000 tons bigger. And instead of having a couple of helicopters, it's got a couple of helicopters and maybe 4 or 5 F-35s on the back. What happens if you don't need to put all your eggs in one basket? What would the Navy, US Navy look like if VTOL has 0 performance penalty and you can do something like that? The details really matter in this regard. If a space-going carrier makes sense in a given work of science fiction, it will be for some reason dependent on the technological assumptions of that work and not for the same reasons that make sense to the current US Navy. So going back to what I said earlier about how the technological assumptions really drive the problem, that applies in this case too. If you really want to do a space-going aircraft carrier, you need to sort of think through why you would do it that way. But once you don't need the flight deck, the hybrids really look like a much better option. You might still get some economies of scale, but you're not locked into this physics problem of the fact that you gotta do it that way in order to make it work, because you no longer have to have a flight deck. So that's pretty much what I have to say. If you got any specific questions, please send me an email at caw@kintaris.com. I'm happy to answer any extra questions, and I'd like to thank you for your time this evening. And now I will turn it back to Claude, who will introduce my good friend Phil Purnell, who I've known for what, Phil, 20 years?
Something like that.
20 some years?
All right, Phil, it's all yours.
All right. All right, I wish to thank Claude and Chris and the others who worked so hard to put this together and invited me to participate. Like the others, the views I express here are strictly my own, and that's why I've got my little weasel friend there, just to, the weasel words we all must say that these are my views and no one else's. Can I get a sound check, please?
You're good, Phil.
All right, thank you. All right, so these views are mine and mine alone. All right, so a long time ago in California, I used to play a role-playing game called Traveler. It was a role-playing game, which, science fiction environment, etc. And as part of it, there was a set of books like High Guard and some others were a NASA's space combat game. And that eventually got put into this Trillion Credit Squadron book, in which you would design a fleet with 1 trillion credits, and then you'd go and fight them. And they would hold these tournaments in California. And this guy, Douglas Lenat, was an early pioneer of artificial intelligence. And he put his network of computers together to analyze the rules from Trillion Credit Squadron and devise a fleet to play in the tournament. And so he'd run it, it would spit out some things. He said, this is ridiculous, and change some factors in it and send the machine back to use this artificial intelligence application. And as part of that, similar to what happens today with the AIs playing Go, et cetera, is the machines would essentially play against each other and then revise the optimization algorithm to design a new fleet. And so he designed a fleet which was a large number of small assets And the depiction I have here is not quite right, but there was no actual depiction of his fleet. But it was, a large number of small assets. And he went to the tournament for a trailing credit squadron, and he played against a bunch of other players who designed their fleets according to the natural historic algorithms. They have destroyers on the sides and maybe a carrier or battleships, etc. And they would, come in with this beautiful fleet, and the opponents would destroy about 60 to 80% of the ships because they hit one ship and it would be gone. Well, but the problem was the other guy's fleet was annihilated. I mean, he would lose 60 to 80% of his fleet, but the other guy would lose everything. And in his initial fleet, they didn't move. He just put these scad of small ships out there, and they really didn't move. And but he would still destroy the other guy's fleet. So they changed the rules like 2 weeks before the tournament just to throw him off. And he still got the computer to churn out a new fleet, which was not, it was a bit more mobile, but not immensely, but still a large number of small assets. And again, he would just absolutely destroy the other guy's fleet. Each individual platform he had would be completely annihilated, and but the other guy's fleet would be completely destroyed. Classic Lanchestrian results. Well, I had my own similar experiences. I used to play Starfleet battles as a kid. And while everybody else would go out and get the classic Enterprise assets, et cetera. And I tinkered with the Montana or something like that at one point. But then I came across the Federation Police Escort, which was super cheap and didn't take a lot of damage, but I could buy a lot of them. And I had a similar experience as Lynott had, in that my opponent, they would have these plasma torpedoes designed to just tear through the shielding of the Enterprise and cripple it. And if one of those plasma bolts hit one of my little police escorts, it would just evaporate. It would just be gone. But I had so many of them, and then they would also launch these drones, that there was just this wave of hate coming at the other guy's fleet. And because you really could only target one or two at a time, I would just annihilate them. Similarly, when the game Ogre came out, and this is a game about a cybernetic tank, a giant cybernetic tank, churning towards the command post to destroy it, and you had forces that you could array to defeat it. One of those assets you could use what's called a JEV, a ground effects vehicle, a hovercraft, an armed hovercraft. And my brother used to play this all the time. And in the original version of it, the JEVs could move 4, shoot, and then move 4 again. And what would happen is they would move in, shoot up the Ogre, and move out. Well, this happened so much, my brother and others did this in a large number, nothing but ground effects vehicles, and it would frustrate the other players. And so Steve Jackson, who designed the game, changed it so that the JEVs could only move the 4 than 3. And yet still the all JEV force was pretty effective. And then there was a game called Masters of Orion. It was a computer-based game, similar kind of thing. I would throw hundreds of ships at it, and it would zap a couple of them, and I would overwhelm the fleet. And there was another space game called Full Thrust, similar to Starfleet Battles, same kind of thing. I build what we call bathtub destroyers, a large number of these destroyers, and just coming at the enemy and tearing them apart. And this was extremely effective, although I started losing opponents I could play against. Okay, well, you ask, does this have any historical analogies? Well, you can see here on this list of ships in World War II, where we churned through, started off with large ships, battleships and cruisers, et cetera, and quickly moved towards, I'm going to shift to another screen so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Well, that's not working. All right, so I'll just go back to this. All right, but if you look over time, specifically, you see my little cursor here, just how many patrol boats we built in World War II. And while everybody points to the Battle of Midway and how the aircraft carriers won it all, et cetera, when you look at the larger force going on, or the larger effort going on, these patrol boats and then the amphibious ships were what we were just churning out. Similarly, we would churn out large numbers of good enough platforms on the land, such as the Sherman tank, etc. Meanwhile, the Japanese and the Germans would pump out these small numbers of exquisitely capable platforms. Well, who won that battle? So, a mentor of mine, Captain Wayne Hughes, who taught at the Naval Postgraduate School, and God rest his soul, wrote Fleet Tactics and Naval Operations. And if you have not read it, I strongly recommend you read it. Now you'll see on the right his cornerstones of naval combat and what's listed in there. But the heart of these, of the lessons learned from his own mathematical modeling of it, or his own kind of paper time machine, is the basic salvo equations. The reason why these large numbers of small platforms in trillion credit squadrons, Starfleet battles, etc., work was because of the game rules and how it looked at how attrition would occur, happen between opposing forces. And so when you have a platform that can inflict just as much damage on a large platform, such as a torpedo boat versus a cruiser, then perhaps it's time to start looking at the little torpedo boats, like my little police escorts that I had used. And this goes directly to what Chris was talking about earlier about, to know your tactics, you must understand the technology. And Wayne Hughes specifically pointed to the fact that we are in the missile age. And then the fact that most combat is going to occur in the littoral waters environment because, well, that's where people live. And so in that kind of a cluttered environment near the shore, you really need to use the attack effectively first concept, where offensive tactics in a surprising environment like the littorals is very different from the blue water. But because that's where people live and where the decisive actions are going to occur, you need to develop a force accordingly. And this is why. Is because the amount of damage that a big ship can take rises very slowly compared to its size. As it gets bigger and bigger, it doesn't take a lot more damage. But as it gets bigger and bigger, if you look at the red line on the bottom, it's easier to see, and therefore also easier for anti-ship cruise missiles to find and hit. So based off of this, we face the issue of the death spiral. We know that ship volumes grow by cubic feet as the length increases. And so it's marginal cost to add a little more and a little more and a little more to your ship, but it starts getting expensive. And then you say, well, we have too few ships. And therefore, each ship is precious. So we must increase the defenses of our ships. So we'll add more defenses to it. But then our ships get more expensive and we can't acquire many. And this creates what I call the death spiral, until inevitably you create the Death Star. And we all know what happens to that. So my solution to this is instead to move to what I call the shell game. If you've ever played the shell game or trying that P under the shell, it's hard. Now, in this case, the shells are like launch stations, and the P is the ships that can launch stuff to attack you. Scale that up. Instead of 1 P and 3 shells, think of 5 Ps and 7 shells. I bet you can't find all 5 Ps. In fact, I can prove it mathematically. It's impossible to do so. So what would the Ps in these launch stations look like? Well, one example is like missile boats. Now, I know Chris was saying earlier that small boats don't do well in changing sea states. Modern technology has greatly improved the capability of small vessels operating in high sea states, including up to sea state 5. And both these missile boats do quite well in those kinds of environments. Imagine on the Juliet Marine Ghost, your top right, carrying 2 to 4 modern anti-ship cruise missiles, such as the Naval Strike Missile, and the Stiletto, the M80 Stiletto down the bottom left, carrying between 4, maybe 8. For those missile boats. But because the US Navy has to operate on a global scale, those vessels can't cross the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans. You need some sort of motherships for them. And new davit and cradle systems can launch and recover such craft up to sea state 5. Modern technology giving these small vessels, which carry the same punch as the bigger ones, the ability to cross and then operate in across seas. There are also other vessels out there, such as the Ambassador missile corvette, carries 4 to 8 anti-ship cruise missiles, built in the United States, very stealthy, very effective, but larger than the missile boats I showed earlier. Another alternative, the Naval Postgraduate School under Wayne Hughes designed the Minuteman missile corvette, which carries 8 anti-ship cruise missiles. Those also would need some sort of mothership to carry them across the ocean, and we have those. We have the mobile landing platform, and we have barge carrying ships, also known as geared ships, to carry them across. So the point being here is large numbers of small ships are not only very survivable, they also create a stable environment in a crisis, because it is impossible for the enemy to track, much less shoot at and kill 80% of your force in one fell swoop without getting a response. I can prove mathematically that's almost impossible. It's a binomial distribution. It's the classic N choose K. Again, think of the shell game. I could put out 5 shells. You find 3 that have the P's under them. Really, really hard. So in turn, rolling back of science fiction informing the design of modern ship concepts, I look back at these games I always played, and the question was whether the rules are applicable. Is the environment and the weapon systems, the game system or the science fiction setting apply to what we're doing currently? And I would say with the modern technologies, smaller systems can be quite deadly, and in fact may be needed in this environment of great power competition. Last but not least, a shameless plug, last 3 books my father wrote are now out. In fact, Mamluks came out just 2 days ago, and I would encourage you to buy them. And David Weber was very kind to assist in the completion of Mamluks, and I would encourage you to buy them. And if you need some motivation, I'll just put it this way. This is essentially the insurance policy of my father. I don't get anything for this, so help my poor widowed mother stay in her home. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. And I'm going to switch back, and if everybody else wants to unmute in just a second, I just have 2 points before we close this up. The first, and hold on for a second, let me just share that screen. All right, first point, all of these are, the entire evening is going to be shifted over to our museum YouTube channel here in the next couple of days. If you have any comments, concerns about this event, here's my email, as I mentioned at the beginning. And more importantly, NavyCon2020 Alpha. That will be done sometime later this year. That will not be from the Naval Academy Museum. Ian Bully, who was one of our presenters, he's with Texas A&M. Ian's got the con for that. So this is his email. We haven't worked out the details yet. And otherwise, we will see you at NavyCon2021. We hope you enjoyed the evening, ladies and gentlemen, and have a great day. Hold fast, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.
All right, guys, you want to stay on for hot wash? Chris, are we good to stop recording and stop the event, and or do you want to take some questions from anybody who is still out there? We've got about, geez.
We did a pretty good job of answering all the questions as they came in.
Right. We got about 130 people still on. You guys, if you want to ask questions, we'll try to answer. Anybody who needs to leave, go ahead. Anybody who wants to stick around and answer some questions, we'll do that too.
Down to 110.
Yeah. No, 124.
I still have a little scotch left.
Hey, this was fun, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, this was definitely a blast.
All right. Chris, you want to kill the record on it?
All right, killing recording now.
Oh, I wish